Good morning. Welcome to the first meeting of 2014 of the Public Audit Committee. And can I ask members and members of the public to ensure that all electronic devices are switched off? Thank you. We have apologies this morning from James Dornan and Willie Coffey, and Christina McKelvey will be here as a substitute, but she's been delayed in traffic, but she will join us at some point. Can we agree to take items 7, 8 and 9 in private? Agreed. Thank you. Item 2 on our agenda is a discussion on the Scotland Act of 2012, and I know that prior to me rejoining the committee there had been some discussion about this some time ago. This morning we have Amyas Morse, who is the Comptroller and Auditor General of the National Audit Office, Mr Edward Troup, who is the second Permanent Secretary, and Sarah Walker, the Deputy Director and Head of Devolution Team, both of HM Revenue and Customs. Welcome to the committee. Would either of you, either Mr Troup or Mr Morse, like to make an opening comment?
Just to say, it's very good to be here again, and thank you for introducing me and my colleagues. Quite a bit has happened since I was last for this committee with Sarah and Amyas a year or so ago, and obviously very happy to update the committee on the details of that. At the sort of higher level, the working relationship continues to be extremely good with the Scottish Government, and I'm going off to spend some time with them after this meeting with colleagues in Revenue Scotland. So we feel that progress on the implementation of the Scottish rate of income tax is definitely on track, and the Office for Government Commerce gave us an amber green on a project progress over the summer. So we feel we're in good shape, but as your committee knows, this is new territory for the UK, so we're sort of very conscious of both your interests but the sort of wider interests of the UK in getting this right, and I'm happy to be here to answer questions, particularly the ones that you have, I know, of concern about our performance and how through Amyas and through my appearing at this committee we can reassure you about what we're doing.
Okay, thank you. Mr Morse?
I'll just take a chance to, you kindly, at our last hearing that we attended, I was kindly given an opportunity to make an opening statement, and I won't do so over that ground again. But what I would like to just reiterate is my good working relationship with Audit Scotland and my preparedness to cooperate closely with them to make sure you get the form of assurance that you find the most useful to you. I don't see any difficulty about any of the options for that being considered, and you're aware of the fact that I have statutory access, and that really isn't easy to change, but given that, I see no difficulty in our working out our working arrangements. Up to date, we have cooperated very well together in a range of issues.
Okay, thank you. Mr Troup, you said that things are going well and you've been given a green light in terms of preparedness. It's just over 2 years before these changes kick in, and 2 years in terms of government planning is not actually that long. And I'm not criticising you, but if you look at many of the major government projects which have been planned and designed across a range of departments, whether it's HMRC, whether it's defence, whether all sorts of procurement, there has been disaster after disaster, particularly, and we can come back to this later, when it comes to IT systems. Now, certainly I would expect that officials will learn as they go, and when there is a mistake there will be an attempt to ensure that mistakes are not repeated. But how can we have confidence that when in less than 2 years the most significant change as far as Scotland is concerned, and perhaps the UK, to the collection and disbursement of taxation takes place, that although you say preparedness is good and the green light, we have a a response from the Scottish Government dated the 7th of January that says in many of the issues the detail remains under discussions and that all aspects have not yet been defined and agreed, and yet we've only got 2 years.
I think there are two areas of response to that. The first is to make the point that the collection of the Scottish rate of income tax is deeply embedded and is an integral part of our wider collection of income tax, which, as you all know, is principally under the PAYE system, although about 10% of receipts come in through self-assessment. Now, both of those are big systems, but they're both existing systems, which we have had challenges with over the years, but are currently running extremely well and smoothly. So we are actually piggybacking. Well, it's not that we're piggybacking, we are just using the existing structure of the PAYE and self-assessment systems, and the principal requirement of the Scottish rate of income tax is simply to require within those systems how much of the receipts from PAYE or self-assessment should be allocated to Scottish taxpayers from which the Scottish rate is drawn. So I don't want to say this is simple, because nothing in the systems of these sort of national scales is ever simple. But in the context of the scale of the IT systems we are already running successfully, and Amyas may want to comment from the NAO's perspective on our performance, this is a very manageable task. So that's the first point I would make. And the second point is a record and performance point on our own IT delivery. And I think I gave either you or the Finance Committee some figures on this when I appeared last year. But in 2012-13, 96% of our IT projects were delivered on time. So far this year, we were up to 93%, and the balance have not gone wrong. We've just delayed them a bit to allow for further testing. And 100% of our major IT projects this year have been delivered on time without defects. So we've actually got a good performance record, currently on our IT performance. So I don't ever want to give the committee the sense that I'm relaxed and I'm not concerned about this, because it's I'm the additional accounting officer and I am concerned. But do I see the IT challenges of this as something which are a cause for concern and significant risk? No, I don't.
As far as the major IT projects are concerned, have HMRC had any difficulties in the last 5 to 10 years with the commissioning of any major IT projects?
I don't have all the stats in front of me. We have, in the last year or so, rolled out real-time information, which actually has been, and obviously this is a change to PAYE, has been one of the biggest changes to PAYE in a generation. And although that's not 100% implemented, I mean, the programme is not completed, the performance to date has been well above our expectations and has been successfully delivered. I don't know whether Amyas wants to say something about that specifically, or IT more generally.
Well, I mean, if you go back over the last 5 years, yes, there have been definitely some hitches, and I wouldn't deny that for a minute, and I don't think it's pointless to say that that's not true. There have been, in the context of big technology changes, and in fairness, I'd have to say that HMRC persisted through those under the leadership primarily of Leslie Strathy, who did a great job, in my view, of weathering a lot of those storms, and ultimately came out with a PAYE system that now works pretty well and actually is a really modern and good one. So I think if I were, if I can, I think the most reassuring thing I would say is, one, I do think the state of the system, the core systems, as far as I can see, are in a stable state at the moment. There's nothing massively changing that you should be worried about relying on. And I think Mr. Troup's comment to you that this doesn't involve some grandiose IT project is probably the most reassuring thing of all. So, I mean, just being, whatever view you take, I have, in fairness, to say that I think the position in IT in HMRC has reached a good, stable place, and they've experienced, having been through some tribulations over the last years, they've actually come through them, largely speaking, and learnt quite a lot from them. So, it would be unfair to say any less than that. But as I say, being pragmatic, my main point is you actually don't need a big IT development to do this.
Sorry, Sarah.
I was just going to add that we were always expecting that the IT development for the Scottish rate of income tax would start in the next financial year, so after April 2014. There is no point doing these things too early because you have to intercept all the other changes in the PAYE system. So if you do it too soon, then you've got to change it again because other things in the system will change. We are well on track for having an IT requirement in place by April this year, although we do say there are still some issues under discussion. They aren't issues that are going to have a major effect on the IT implementation.
How significant will the new system be? I think Mr Morse and Mr Troup have suggested that it's not grandiose, it's not huge, but how significant will the new IT system have to be to cope with these changes?
It's on the scale of the sorts of changes, compared with real-time information, compared with the PAYE rebuild we did 2 or 3 years ago, this is much, much smaller. A lot of the way it would work had already been worked out in order to deal with the Scottish variable rate, which has been in legislation since 1998. It's never been used. So we already had a pretty clear understanding about how it would work in PAYE. Clearly there are some differences with the Scottish rate, which is what we're doing now. And the main difference is for us to be able to put an identifier onto the tax code of people who are Scottish taxpayers, and that then triggers employers to deduct a tax at a different rate. That's something that we were always expecting to have to do for the Scottish variable rate. Then the other things that need to be done are about the accounting and making sure that we can track that money through into the money that gets paid over to the Scottish Government. And again, we understand how that works, and that is pretty well understood. Okay.
Mary Scanlon.
Thank you. I appreciate that you're still discussing many issues with officials and that there's still many aspects to be defined and indeed agreed. But the last time you were here, we were discussing compliance, prosecution rates, error and fraud levels, tax gaps and debt roll. Mr Troup, you've talked about how much receipts will be allocated to Scotland. I appreciate I cannot ask you the discussions you're having with officials, but how much information is it appropriate to, for us to have as an audit committee ongoing? You'll appreciate this is new to us as well. Do we need to, does Scotland need to know about compliance and prosecution rates, error and fraud levels, tax gaps, taxes written off, and tax disputes, or is one sum essential? I'm just not sure the level of information that is essential or indeed is appropriate here, and I seek your guidance.
This is definitely an issue for continuing dialogue, and I wrote to the convener before Christmas about this. Yeah. But just to step back a little, I think the question is really how much distinguished information do you need from the general information about all of these things which appear in our accounts, which we report our performance on, and obviously which the NAIO scrutinise. And I think, again, just putting a bit of context around that question, just looking at the way income tax works and coming back to the point that 90% of income tax comes in through PAYE, which broadly, just comes in. Yeah. The 10% comes in through self-assessment. And of the total receipts which we in the UK get from income tax, 99% comes in without any intervention from us. Yeah. Because actually we are a compliant nation or nations. Yeah. Tax is paid because there is confidence in the integrity of the system and everything else. So for that 99%, in a sense, your questions are probably simply about accounting. Are we actually making sure that of the 200 billion or so we get in aggregate, that we are giving the appropriate amount out of that 99% to you, which is an accounting processes which absolutely we need to get right, and which Amyas and the NEO need to be happy are right. So the question about our compliance and prosecutions and our debts, really only relates to that last 1%, where we do apply compliance activity in order to make sure we get it in. We've improved our compliance processes nationwide. Our performance on reducing the tax gap and compliance yield, and all of this is published. Has improved over the last few years and is on an improving trend. How much of that relates to the different categories of compliance? Again, you can look at the aggregate tax gap numbers, but when you look at that 1%, there is a certain amount of compliance work through employers, because employers misapply PAYE, they don't put expenses through, they just put the wrong codes through and whatever. And that employer compliance work, we do have a successful yield from. But it is extremely difficult for us to disaggregate that between Scottish and non-Scottish taxpayers, certainly when it comes to UK-wide employers. So while you are interested in that, because that is getting in additional money which would add to the PAYE receipts, it is hard for us to disaggregate it, and I think the bulk of your reliance must be on our general employer compliance work, which there is data on and there is information on, and we can disaggregate. There is also direct compliance work with the self-assessment population. Those individuals who file returns and don't put things on, or put the wrong things on, or claim the wrong expenses, or just don't file. And there it is possible, with a bit of work and with a bit of changes to our systems, to get some information about Scottish taxpayers as opposed to UK taxpayers. And that is something which, in the course of discussions with the Scottish Government, we can look, albeit there will be some marginal cost to that, in providing some more information. I think the question for you, and you asked for guidance, is how much extra value is that going to give to you in the comfort that of that 1% of aggregate compliance addition to the 99%, that you're going to get some extra information which is going to reassure you over and above the core reassurance that we as a department and an administration will do act even-handedly. We have no interest in applying compliance processes differentially between England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And indeed, under the current setup, we have at least as much skin in the game in receipts from Scottish taxpayers as you have, because you've got 10p and we've got a further 10p, or indeed a further 35p, plus all the national insurance. So that, I think, is the question for you. Yes, we can do a bit on the self-assessment population. There isn't much we can do on the PAYE population because of the nature of PAYE, but the overall reassurance, I think, in bulk, at the highest level, comes from the fact that it's the 99% that really matters to you. Sorry, that's a long answer, but hopefully it's given you some thoughts to work with.
No, I do understand that, and it would be it wouldn't be in line with the canons of taxation to spend so much money trying to understand 1% if it didn't give you any additional understanding into the operation. But it was more about understanding if our economy was any different, or people were behaving any differently here than elsewhere in the United Kingdom. So my final question is probably, given that there are ongoing discussions, and I note that you're off to see Revenue Scotland today, at what point in the next 2 years will you be able to give us more detailed information following your discussions? At what point will everything be decided and agreed between yourselves, Revenue Scotland, about information and any other information that would be appropriate to this Parliament?
I'll let Sarah give some sort of detailed comments on timing, but I would say that in a sense this is never going to be finally decided. We will go into the implementation of the Scottish rate of income tax with a view as to what information we will share with you from our existing system systems or for anything you want to pay from. But this will be it's an active relationship, it will be an active engagement, and I absolutely expect that we will change the information that we give as we see what's useful to you and what's possible for us to provide. And, you know, we are a department that's changing itself. We are moving into a more digital world. It may well be that we find that it is possible to give more information in 3 or 4 years' time than we can currently do, and we'd certainly want to do that. So this isn't going to be finally settled, but we clearly do want to go into the implementation of the Scottish rate with a clear sense, you having a clear sense of what we want to provide. Do you want to just answer on timing, Sarah?
Yes, we are obliged to publish an annual report on the implementation of the Scotland Act under Section 33 of the Scotland Act itself. The next report will be published before the 1st of May. That will be when we will have come to a pretty clear view that the design of the processes that we're going to operate to make the Scottish rate of income tax work, for instance, including how we're going to identify Scottish taxpayers, how we're going to contact them, how we're going to deal with address changes during the year, that kind of thing. That will give us a basis to refine the cost estimates that we know you're very interested in, and we are too, clearly. I think it's at that point, once we've got a clearer idea of the process, that we'll go into the next phase of our discussions on performance information. I don't think we have a clear sort of target date to have that agreed, particularly where they don't require any new IT changes, which I don't think many of them will. There isn't a sort of time pressure on that point of view, so it's really a matter for us to discuss with the Scottish Government.
That's fine, thank you.
Okay, Tavish Scott.
Thank you. Can I just go back, Mr. Troup, to the point you were making about companies? Can I take, I don't know, Boots the chemist, who obviously operate on a UK-wide basis? I don't know if they run their payroll and PAYE out of Basingstoke or wherever it is, but for sake of argument, it's presumably south of the border, given the nature of the company. What's your observation to the committee? Is it that we, and indeed for that matter you, will not be able to accurately assess how much of that Boots the chemist PAYE allocates to Scotland, because they will know how many employees they have in Scotland, which we can no doubt ask them and so on and so forth. But how do we tie these two things together? The number of Boots chemists working in Scotland as opposed to the amount of money the Scottish Revenue Scotland will gain from PAYE from Boots the company.
Okay, can I not talk about any named taxpayer, even though I wouldn't necessarily know anything about their individual affairs? But if you have a national, retail employer, which by definition is going to have employees around the country, the employer compliance work will go in to their, let's say, their core PAYE system and look at the way in which expenses are posted, the way codes are allocated, and whether the updated codes they receive from us are properly allocated. And very often a bit of employer compliance work will disclose that a particular form of, let's say, benefit in kind, the cars have been misposted, or a particular category of expense has been treated as non-taxable, or that the arrangement for dealing with a particular class of expenses is not the agreement, and there are quite a lot of agreements with individual taxpayers about kinds of expenses has not been properly applied, or just amounts haven't been put through. That will take the aggregate information off their PAYE system, and from that we will compute an adjustment to their liability, and that will result in a compliance settlement, which will result both in a payment to us and an appropriate adjustment to our receipts, as well as, one would expect an agreement from the business to change their practices going forward. Now, we would not normally, as part of that compliance work, disaggregate the compliance yield between Scottish and non-Scottish taxpayers. I think, it is theoretically, probably, in reality, it is possible to do so. I think the question is, given the way in which the payments to you are accounted for that last 1%, and remember that is settled up a year after, 12 months after the end of the period, and very often these compliance activities will take place later on. So in a sense, you will already be accepting payment with a best estimate of an aggregate of what that 1% comprises, is it going to be worthwhile for each and every one of those national employer compliance settlements to put in what would be further additional systems to report back how much of compliance intervention allocated to Scottish and non-Scottish taxpayers? And I say, it's not that this couldn't be done, because I think it probably, I mean, since anything could be done at some expense. So that's the trade-off, and it comes back to my response to Mrs. Scanlon about the 1%. What is the context for this?
But no, and I take that, it's very fair, but presumably, therefore, the point to Mr. Morse might be, as the Scottish Parliament stroke the Scottish Government's check on HMRC's ability to do their job properly, we might be asking you to pick a couple of examples, or to say, to use, for example, a couple of UK companies who, for example, in the North Sea oil sector have more employees in Scotland than they do in London, but still run their systems out of London. That might be an area where we might, for sake of argument, be interested in the compliance record of that particular organisation. And would it therefore be reasonable to ask you to look into that and to report on that basis?
Well, it would depend on, I mean, and again, I'm going to be I'll just step back a little bit and say two things. One of them is, in doing my work in terms of the financial audit of HMRC and of looking at their systems and controls, I will be looking at that on an aggregate basis. Mm-hmm. So a little bit difficult for me to say, well, I'll tilt that around as part of my ordinary work. So I don't want to hold out that's necessarily straightforward to do. What I could do is if the information was going to be extracted, in other words, if you decided that you wanted, and it occurred to me as I was listening to this discussion, there's an interesting point. It's quite, I mean, it's an interesting proposition for members of this Parliament to say, well, now, what Mr. Troup is saying is entirely correct and reasonable. On the other hand, it's taken quite a lot on trust to say, well, wouldn't you like to test some of this stuff somehow? And I can understand that you might feel it appropriate to understand what it might cost for HMRC to be able to give you some additional information and what they could extract, and spend a certain amount of money in testing whether that information was really useful to you or not, rather than just simply saying, oh, no, thanks very much, we're fine. You might do either of them, and neither of them is illogical. But if you did ask for specific information, I would be happy to examine it and audit it. What I can't necessarily do is when I am auditing the whole of HMRC, I have to do my examination based on the fact that I'm auditing the whole of HMRC. So unfortunately, you'd have to probably do something a bit additional to that for me to be able to cover it. If you chose to do that, well, of course, we'd look at any such additional information and give whatever assurance we were able to give, depending on the quality of that information.
Yeah. Okay, but in terms of this example, I'm trying to use around a UK company. When you were looking at HMRC's record in terms of the compliance work they had done and therefore the more revenue they had been able to gain through that work, would you look at it, as you've just illustrated, on a UK-wide basis, or would you also look at it in the context of Scotland's interest in that?
Well, what we don't tend to do is to go taxpayer by taxpayer. Yeah. So if what we found was that there was a record of failure of control or a weakness in controls, we'd pick that up. We might examine that over a range. But what we don't generally do is to go top to toe in a particular taxpayer and say, well, we're going to go in and just check how you're dealing with this particular one. Because what we're doing, if I can remind you, is financial audit work. Now, that might be different if we were examining a particular... It might be that we do a sample of companies if we were examining some aspect of HMRC from the value for money point of view. But again, we'd be looking at that from the point of view of the overall efficiency and effectiveness of the system. It's quite unusual for us, I mean, it's not unheard of, but it's unusual for us to examine a series of specific taxpayers. It just, because we're looking at it as a whole system, we don't tend to typically do that.
No.
I'm trying to think of ways to be helpful on this, but in a sense, it's quite hard. But it sort of comes back to the question: is this about information? Would you like to know that actually PAY is not complied with Scottish taxpayers as well as it is by English taxpayers? Or vice versa. Remembering that it's about employers rather than the individuals. Or do you want some reassurance that actually we are not differentially dealing with PAY compliance? Now, almost by definition, we're not, because in the company example you gave, we are looking at the company. We're not, saying we're looking at its Scottish or its English employees. And if you want comfort on the integrity of our compliance, then in a sense that comes back to what can the NAO generally tell you about our overall activities, and what can we tell you, because I mean, we do publish performance information about what we get from employer compliance, and I'm quite happy to come up and talk to you if you have a particular interest in employer compliance, with information from my compliance colleagues, and tell you how last year's employer compliance activities have looked.
Can I turn it the other way? Instead of asking about a UK-wide company basis on English companies versus Scottish companies versus Welsh versus wherever, in geographical terms, do you, in terms of your compliance work at the moment, have any geographic consideration whatsoever, and do you think you might in the future?
No, none at all. We have, as you know, we have basically a risk-based approach, and that's both data-driven, in that we use some quite sophisticated data tools, and we hope to get even more sophisticated with them, to identify taxpayers who we think look more high risk. So, we will literally generate lists of business names in a particular region and say, actually, we need to ask them some questions because there's some characteristics of what's coming out of the system which tells us that they are more high risk. And we also look at the higher risk taxpayers in terms of size and type. And as you probably know, our large businesses have a much more attentive regime from us than the small businesses, which we deal with more on a risk and sample basis. So there is no deliberate geographic consequence of that. But were we, hypothetically, and I don't know how the risk rating in different industries go, say there is a particular area of risk in the oil industry, that might well have geographical consequences, and we might find ourselves looking at more companies for that particular category of risk based in Aberdeen than in Aberystwyth. Geographical consequences can flow from our risk-based approach.
So it's much more sectoral than in that
absolutely.
sense.
Absolutely. And risks take us to sectors, types of companies. They do not take us regionally. The only thing we do regionally is we do regional campaigns. And that's partly because we've got finite resources, and actually having campaigns in different areas helps raise levels of compliance. I know, because I saw some of the colleagues, we had a campaign around the scrap metal industry. I think it was in the northeast and the northwest of England where there were particular problems, and that was quite effective. We've had them against barristers in London, and we've launched, and I don't think we've concluded, one against the fishing industry, which actually has had quite a lot of Scottish impact necessarily.
Kind of aware of that.
So, and if we're going to the fishing industry, then we clearly do go, for the location.
Absolutely. Can I ask one other one, Covino, if I may? And that's on Susan Walker's earlier point about the systems in relation to the variable tax rate. I absolutely take your point that it's not been used up until now, but obviously the difference coming in is the 10p rate, and the Scottish Finance Secretary of the day will have to set that. And it's in the hypothetical circumstance, and it is hypothetical, where the Finance Secretary of the day decides to vary that. I guess, and this is a couple of years away, but how is the system going to cope with that? Because it always strikes me that it's pretty straightforward if it's across the UK, taxation rates, etc., but as soon as there's variances, then that's going to create a greater challenge for you. And then how do we assess that you're doing your job adequately so we see the revenue returns from that?
I think the sort of mechanics of it are fairly straightforward. The rate should be set in the autumn of the year when the Scottish Government budget is published. That will allow us, and I think we've got an agreement that it's got to be done, or we would like it to be done by the 1st of December, so that allows us to incorporate it in the tax codes that are issued in around Christmas each year for employers, We then give employers the instruction of the rate to deduct, and that then applies. So in terms of the 99% that's automatic, it's within our normal coding system. In terms of compliance, clearly if there's a different rate in Scotland and the rest of the UK, then the risk basis for compliance work, which Edward was talking about, will also have to take into account that there is now an incentive potentially for people to want to be classified on one side or the other side of the border. And there we will then need to look at, clearly if there was a sudden flood of people who reporting changes of addresses, that would be a risk. We would need to look into that. There might be more people who have two addresses and tell us that actually now they're spending more time in the other one or they're living in the other. So I think there will be issues there, and one of the things we need to develop in our compliance approach is how we'd actually deal with that. We have all sorts of data sources to check people's addresses. One of the things that we're looking at doing for the initial setup of the system, 2015. So yes, and clearly we will be discussing that approach with the Scottish Government as well. Indeed,
but the data systems you have would start to, as it were, ping up when literally thousands of, well, I don't know, but a significant, statistically significant number of people were changing their circumstances.
Yes, if we got thousands and thousands of people suddenly telling us they'd moved from one side of the border to the other, then that would certainly alert us.
Good, thank you.
Before I call anyone else, can I come back to what we've been discussing? Mr. Morse, you said that you audit whole systems. That then begs the question, what, if anything, would you then be reporting to the Scottish Parliament?
Well, what we would do specifically for the Scottish Parliament is to prepare, to give our report as required by the legislation on the abstract and how it's been abstracted from the whole system. So how has the Scottish rate of income tax been separated? Are the calculations, as far as we can tell, sound? Any other information you ask for, how has that been done? We will provide a report of that, and that's what's required of us by legislation. That's what we will do. And if you want, as we go forward on that, if the Parliament would find it helpful to have we will express our opinion in as clear a way as we possibly can, in addition to what's required of us by statute, to try and fit in with what the Parliament finds helpful, commensurate with what evidence we've actually got that we're capable. And then, what decides the level of assurance we can give you is how much specific information to Scotland we've actually got available to us. So that will be the limiting factor. But so we are obliged but the legislation calls upon us to report in a particular style, with providing a narrative report to you, rather than, and that will provide a view on the accuracy of the sums brought to account by HMRC, and I will supplement this with further certification as far as I'm able to, based on the evidence that I've got. So what I will try and do is to have an open dialogue with you about, when we do that report, if there's more, would you like more and more specific, we can do that either working with Audit Scotland or we can do it ourselves, depending on what information you decide to require of HMRC.
But if you're, sorry Mr. Troup, but if you're certifying that the whole system is efficient?
Well, what we're doing is we are carrying out now I'm going to start speaking auditese, and I apologise for that for a moment. You'll just forgive me. We do two things. First of all, we certify that the accounts are true and fair view. In other words, the whole accounts of HMRC, so of which Scottish income tax is a part, obviously. And we also certify regularity, which is we express an opinion on whether the funds voted by Parliament for the administration of the tax system have been applied as Parliament intended. So we do those two opinions. In addition to that, we're going to provide what we're required to do for you is to provide you with a narrative-type report on how the actual the Scottish rate of income tax has been.
But will that narrative include a comment on whether the calculation and collection of the Scottish rate of income tax has been done accurately?
It will certainly include a comment on how that's been calculated. Whether it'll say it's been done accurately, blanket certification, but it will certainly address that question.
So, sorry, just a final question before I'll let you in. But,
please do.
How then will we know whether all the Scottish income tax that has been identified or assessed is actually being collected? Who will make that calculation? Who will make that decision?
Can I try and help here?
Okay.
Because our accounts will contain a separate report on how much is due to you. And I was actually looking at the clause in the finance bill, which will come forward shortly, which I think you've probably seen in draft. And I don't want to put Amyas too much on the spot, but it does actually require him to do some things. And it says it must prepare a report on the following matters, and one of those matters is the correctness of the sums brought to account by HMRC which relate to Scottish rate of income tax, and also must contain a report on the accuracy and fairness of the amounts which are reimbursed to HMRC, i.e. the charges that we put to you. So there are some quite clear obligations, but I was also going to go on and say that the subsequent subsection 4 says that the report under this section, i.e. Amyas's report, may, so it's up for him to decide, may also include an assessment of the economy, efficiency and effectiveness with which we have used our resources to carry out these functions, which hopefully are words this committee will like, because I hope we will be doing that with economy, efficiency and effectiveness. So, but it's then a matter of choice as to whether...
That last one, the may is important because it means that it's at my discretion. And the reason why that's important is because I don't want to be churning out a report on this subject to you every year if there's nothing additional to say to what I've already said in my general report. In other words, if there's nothing more that I can look at, there's no point in my saying, well, I'll do what is effectively a value for money type report every year. It's just not worth your while to have that. If, on the other hand, there are issues that arise where, and we'll have a dialogue about it, if there are issues that arise which need such a specific report, I'll be happy to do it.
Okay. Mr. Troup, can I take you back to some of what you said earlier in response to Tavish Scott about how the Scottish taxes, or the Scottish element of the taxes, would be collected? Are there additional costs which will pertain to large employers who are based in England but who have a significant Scottish workforce in terms of collection of and identification of the Scottish element of tax?
Costs for us or costs for the employer?
No, costs for the employer.
Employers should already have a large part of this functionality in their payroll systems because they have been required to be ready for the Scottish variable rate. All they will need to do is to be able to recognise the fact that we have sent a tax code with an S on it, so that identifies the employee as a Scottish taxpayer, and then apply if necessary, apply a different tax rate to that calculation. So employers are not required to decide whether their employees are Scottish taxpayers or not. They simply are obliged to operate the code which will identify what we believe to be their status. It shouldn't be a big change for employers to be able to apply the Scottish tax codes. As I say, that's already, a lot of them will already have it built into their systems. So we don't think that it'll be a big deal for employers. We don't think it'll be a big extra cost.
Okay.
I don't think we can guarantee there's no additional cost, but the whole principle of PAYE, and most of the PAYE software packages update automatically every year, is that this will be built into the current PAYE software package. The coding notice will come out, and everybody gets a code notice, and these ones will have S's on it. They will be taken by the businesses, and in a sense they will be doing nothing different for a Scottish employee than from an English one, which is to take a code received from us, put it in their systems, and apply the results. So there should not be any significant marginal cost.
And can I just clarify, in terms of collection and aggregating the amount due for the Scottish rate of income tax to the Scottish Government. Is it simply a proportion of the aggregate taxation which you collect in and is assessed, or is it the aggregate of all the individual taxpayers with that code of S?
It will be the latter, for the simple reason that when we get a lump sum of PAYE from an employer, we need to know which employees that relates to, right, so that for that any particular employee, we are able to reconcile at the end of the year whether he or she has overpaid, underpaid, or accurately paid their tax liability for the year, which is a process which we do every year. So we will be quite clear within our PAYE system how much PAYE has been accounted for each individual Scottish taxpayer, and to add that up within our systems.
Okay, thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you. Essentially, I've got three questions here. We've already obviously explored the issue that there is a certain lack of information here in regard to disaggregation of information and so forth, and that creates some limitations. Now, I understand that at a UK level, NAOs would probably give overall reassurance across the UK without being specific necessarily in these respects to the Scottish part. What I'm struggling with is, I know it's been touched on before, but how are we going to get that reassurance to the Scottish Parliament and to the Scottish Government that the PAYE and self-assessment systems are operating even-handedly across the UK? Who's going to give that reassurance?
Well, I think it sort of comes back to the answer to the first question the committee put, which is that 99% of it just comes in automatically. So as long as the systems are working and that actually we are putting the S codes against the right taxpayers, that 99% will come in a sense, the question of even-handedness in a sense isn't really applicable because it is just an overall system. The issue of even-handedness, I think, to the extent that it's applicable, does come to our compliance activity, and that we are not selectively adding to that 99% preferentially by going after employers with principally with principally English employees, or going principally against English self-assessors. Now, we will not, and as I said, you've got the overarching reassurance that we have as much more skin in the game for a Scottish individual as you do, and if not more. And it comes back to the sort of wider point of our responsibility as a tax administration. We have a responsibility to the entire nations, all of the nations of the UK, for whom we are collecting tax, to do that in an even-handed way across the whole United Kingdom. But I mean, I think the discussion so far has shown that it is quite difficult, because in a sense it's proving a negative, to demonstrate that somehow we are not doing that in a way which disadvantages for that 1% Scottish taxpayers.
Can I just add something? And as we review the controls of the system as a whole, if the system was such that it was easy for somebody at the centre to sit there and say, you know what, we won't give them, we'll divert or we'll reclassify monies, I would expect we would be looking at that in looking at the system. It wouldn't necessarily just be in regard to Scotland versus England. We'd be looking at that as to the overall controls of PAYE and the controls in the revenue. And there are checks and balances in revenue which are intended to prevent this sort of thing from being done if anyone were trying to do it. So most of the controls and the audit work we carry out is designed to test the control environment and make sure that it's strong enough that things like that are, I mean, nothing is impossible, but not likely to happen, and there are good controls against it.
I understand what you're saying, and I understand where that's coming from. I suppose the thing is, purely from an audit point of view, there's a bit of an act of faith here that these 99% are going to be accurate in terms of the Scottish portion. And I guess, I realise we're probably stuck because of the limitations on the system with getting a sort of a general reassurance. I don't know. But certainly from an audit point of view, I would say that from sitting around this table, there's a certain weakness there.
Well, can I just, sorry, if you let me just say a little bit more. Well, there are two aspects. I don't want to oversell anything, but let's look at the dynamics of it. There's the examination of the overall system, and then there is the calculation of the portion which is attributable to Scottish income tax. And so not only do we at the NAO have an obligation to examine the overall system, we also have an obligation, as we've just been hearing, to report specifically on how accurately and how reasonably the calculations have been made of that portion that relates specifically to Scotland. So one of them is the assurance you take of the overall system, and anybody can interfere with the system as a whole, in which case your risk is no different to anybody else's. And then it's the taking out the Scottish piece, which is a bit which is very much in your specific interest, and there you need to look at our work and say, are you satisfied with that? And I've indicated earlier our willingness to collaborate with Audit Scotland to give you some increment. I mean, they can't go in and do the audit work, but they can certainly collaborate with us in looking at how we've done it and give you their extra reassurance that they think we've done it in a reasonable fashion. I'm more than happy, absolutely willing and open to anything of that sort. And I've said this previously when I appeared here, and I continue to be very willing to do anything like that which gives the Parliament additional assurance.
I was simply going to make the point that there's another external check on this, which is that the OBR will forecast the receipts of Scottish rate for any particular year, and if we end up significantly diverging from that, I mean, it would certainly raise a question as to why has that happened, and we would certainly want to understand that, and you would want to understand that. Now, that may not tell you, exactly what you might want to know, but it will certainly be a flag against us sort of somehow doing something untoward.
It would place us on inquiry.
I guess my second question is a bit of a spin-off from the first. At the heart of all this, the key thing here is identifying the Scottish taxpayers. That's, in the initial stages, that is the most important thing. In the first year or two, let's say, is there going to be any additional audit process which would cover that particular aspect? I realise once it's bedded in and running on, that's fine, but the first year or two will be the process of identifying the Scottish taxpayers and putting everything in place regarding that. Will there be a specific audit that covers that?
So there's a question there about what are we doing, but there's also a question about whether what we do to identify Scottish taxpayers at the outset is going to be audited. I don't know whether Sarah wants to say something, whether, Amyas, you want to come back and say whether you were going to look at the way in which we identified Scottish taxpayers.
Well, we'd certainly look at it to see if it was reasonable and if it made sense and if it appeared to be applied properly, yes. That doesn't mean that we go around checking every single bit of it. Now, let me be very, very plain. I'm not offering that. But what we would do is to look at the approach and say, does the way they've done this look reasonable? Do they seem to have done it in a way which was careful, reasonable, and to the standard that we would expect to in such a sensitive matter, and we'd look at it from that level.
And I would be quite happy to come back and to explain to you, as we do this process in 2015, 16, how it's going and what our experience has been, and I probably will be able to provide you some information about the numbers that we've identified, the number of cases where it's not been self-evident whether they're Scottish resident or not, and what processes we have applied in following up. In other words, the sort of things which Amyas, were he coming in to do a full audit of it, might ask. So I don't see why I shouldn't be able to come back and give you that reassurance during the course of the identification process. I mean, all we can do at the moment is tell you what we're going to do. We're already doing some address matching at a sort of data level, but obviously we're some way away from actually going out and engaging with the population.
I think what Mr. Troup's proposing there would be actually very useful and backed up by Mr. Morse's reassurances, for want of a better word. I think that would give a lot of comfort.
Although I'll be clear, I don't think Amyas is committing to do an audit of what we're doing. I'm offering, in a sense, to just come and talk to you about what we're doing.
I've taken that Mr. Morse is talking about in order to the processes and so on that allow for the identification of the taxpayers and so forth.
Yes, the only difference, to be very clear, what I was carefully picking my words and saying we'd look at the process and see if it was reasonable. That doesn't mean we'd check every bit of it, and I did say that quite clearly last time. I'm just repeating myself. But can I also just mention something? That's not the only factor in the, and I know you appreciate it, but it's just worth spelling out. There are two factors that may be a bit distortive in the first place, and Mr. Troup's mentioned them both at different points. One of them would be if there was some identification procedural shortfall in the way identification is done. The other would be that you might have people trying to get themselves on either side of the line, and it'll take time for that to, depending on where their tax advantage lay. I mean, maybe not, but they might do. And it'll take time for that to all get nailed down quite as closely, because people may have a reasonable argument. So it's not, some of this, there will be a bit of, there'll be a bit of sort of dust being thrown up in the initial year, almost whatever, and rather than pretending that it might all be absolutely perfect, that's most unlikely, because there are these various factors which will need to get sorted as quickly as possible. I'm just, I think if I manage your expectations sensibly, I think even with the best exertions that everybody can make, it's likely that it'll be a little bit, it'll be a little opaque in the first year, and it'll get clearer as you go forward. I just think that's reasonable to say.
Okay. Third question really is picking up on what Mr. Morse was talking about previously in connection with producing the accounts, auditing the accounts. In the past, HMRC's accounts have in fact been qualified for various reasons over some years. What would the implications be? Would it be conceivable that an audit of SRIT might be qualified, and what would the implications be?
Whenever you do an audit, it's always conceivable that an opinion on anything could be qualified. It is a little bit of a hypothetical question, and I'm not going to therefore think up some reasons why I might qualify the SRT audit in advance of the fact. I think that's asking me, it's a bridge too far. But what I can say is that the reasons for qualification have always been quite specific. It's not been to do with a general lack of control or any of what I call really big audit issues. It's generally been things like issues of they've generally been regularity qualifications. That's to say, if there's been just not absolute clarity on what tax reliefs and allowances might be being claimed, it's generally been related to that sort of fraud and error area where the burden of proof for regularity opinion is the tolerance is much lower than it would be for a true and fair opinion that you would see in a company or any other body. So the fact there has been a qualification, while significant, of course, isn't to say the records were, their records weren't in a good state of control, but there are sometimes simply imponderables which come out of the system, which mean that you can't be certain that the funding that Parliament has voted has all been applied to the level of accuracy that you would like. That can happen.
In terms of the Scottish Parliament, if there was such a qualification, how would that be escalated? Obviously, you'd be highlighting it, but who would you highlight it to in the Scottish Government? What would be the process?
Well, I imagine that we would, I mean, first of all, if there was a qualification, we would express that qualification formally on the record. And it would be, it's then a matter of public knowledge that we've qualified.
Yes, I think it is a hypothetical. And obviously our effort is into making sure these accounts are accurate, and there are no such qualifications. And I'm sorry that I'm not the principal accounting officer, so I've not had to deal with the PAC face-to-face on what happens with qualifications on our accounts, but that's ultimately where it comes back to, isn't it?
Well, I think it might,
yes,
perhaps if I just explain where I'm coming from. I'm trying to get to the point of how would it come to this committee, because it has to come to this committee ultimately. If it's escalated, it would be escalated presumably to the Scottish Government, Parliament, and eventually come here, but what is that process?
Can I just clarify? I think for most purposes that we're talking about, as I've said, what I'm committed to do is to provide a narratival style report. That report will come as I understand it, in the first instance to this committee. I think that's right. And if I had serious concerns about the quality of the calculations on separation of the Scottish rate of income tax, I would come and personally report to you and tell you that. Okay? Can I be, is that clear? I think that's rather more germane than saying, let me describe a process to you. I won't describe a process. I will tell you that if I had serious concerns, I'd come and tell you about it. Because I would be addressing a report to you, and I expect, if that report contains such concerns, I expect to come and speak to you specifically and personally about them, and I would do so. And so, even though it is a hypothetical, I'll give you that assurance right now.
And I think I would add to that, although I haven't thought this through, it is almost certainly the case that the issues would arise under the Memorandum of Understanding if matters relating to our accounting for the Scottish rate were qualified. And as discussed with this committee before, there are a whole lot of processes under the Memorandum of Understanding which involve escalating up eventually to the Joint Exchequer Committee if we, in dialogue with the Scottish Government, cannot resolve whatever those issues are. So that is the sort of the administrative process which would bring it back to ministers and the government on your side.
You know, I'm not sure that that point's actually been clarified in the past. It's quite an important one as to how this committee becomes involved where there is a qualification such as this.
Yeah, I think the report has to be laid before Parliament no later than the 31st of January of the financial year following that, to which the report relates. So if it's laid before Parliament, then it gives this committee the opportunity.
Again, I guess we're all trying to get clarification here. It would only be at that point, when annually, when the report is laid,
Yes.
that it would come to us.
Yes.
Up to that point, it wouldn't.
That's correct. Okay.
Okay, I think that's clear in my mind.
Certain that something which, in the very unlikely event of qualification, had got that far, would have come up through the Memorandum of Understanding, because there would have been something which would have caused concern between ourselves and the Scottish Government on that before then. So, you know, while you do need to make sure you've got formal oversight, in practice I think an awful lot of engagement would have happened before this hypothetical occurred.
I mean, sorry to keep on coming back in, but I will one final time. It's far more likely in practice that if there was something that I was concerned the committee might not be, that I was concerned that you need to have something clarified, and in my view I had a divergent view of it to what HMRC had, I'd want to come and talk to you about it. It's not likely to be a qualification, actually, to be quite frank with you, most likely, but it might be some matter of clarity or emphasis that I was worried about, that I felt you hadn't quite got, I wasn't quite comfortable that you got the full picture on. If that, and I don't really believe that would happen deliberately, but if it did, I would feel obliged to, I would feel that I was under a duty to come and tell you about it, and I'd also be liaising with Audit Scotland about it too. So, just to be clear.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Ken McIntosh.
Thank you. I also want to return to the issue of accountability, but first, if I may, just pursue the same lines that every other member has, which is about identifying Scottish taxpayers, just to clarify a couple of issues about the figures, particularly, Mr Troup, you're using. Can I just check that 90% of income tax is generated through the PAYE system? Sorry, is it 90% of taxpayers pay through PAYE, or is it 90% of the tax take is PAYE?
These are slightly rounded figures. It is actually of the tax take, but it may well also be broadly true for the taxpayers as well. I don't know, Sarah, have you got any more accurate figures? Broadly 10% under PAYE, and that would, under self-assessment, and that would broadly relate to the number of taxpayers as well. I don't think there's a material difference in the average amount of tax paid by a PAYE taxpayer from a self-assessment taxpayer.
Well, just that the figures, particularly for those high net worth individuals who pay tax, is actually, the contribution they make is increasing, and although it's smaller in Scotland, I would have thought that it would still be disproportionate.
For that small number, but of course remember the self-assessment includes all the self-employed, and they're the overwhelming numerical bulk of self-assessment taxpayers, and who obviously have quite a dispersed, and actually quite a lot of them have rather low incomes, because you know there are some small and self-employed businesses.
Indeed. So again, because you suggested earlier that you'd be able to identify 99%.
Sorry, I hope I haven't confused the committee. The 9010 is about the mechanism through which we collect tax. Then there is a numerical statement about whether, for the entirety of that population, that cash comes in as a result of us just sitting there running some good systems and allowing people to file online or put in PAYE returns, or requires us to actually go out and chase the money down. And that's the 99% to 1%. 99% of all of the money comes in without us doing anything at all, other than running some good systems and generating confidence in the integrity of the system.
So, in other words, once the system is in place, you believe you'll be able to because again, I was a bit confused by the fact that you can't disaggregate national insurance necessarily from income tax. You'll be able to accurately identify, to within 1%, the amount of money that is raised in income tax in Scotland.
Yes, but
there won't be an estimate.
The 99% will come in by the time we have to account to you for it, and we will know exactly what we've got in, because that will just be factual receipts where we have literally just sat there and the money has come in. And that will be a sort of a fact. It will have come in, and as long as our systems are correctly identifying Scottish taxpayers, that will simply drop out as a number which we can say of effectively the voluntary receipts. Voluntary is not quite the right word. The receipts which come in without any intervention or action. This is the number. This is what we have had.
So just to can I give you two hypothetical situations just to check the system would how it will operate. If there was to be a tax change in Scotland, of the Scottish tax rate, clearly there would be a concern that this would generate tax flight of some sort or other. Or perhaps actually, if there was a cut, it would be generate tax flight from the rest of the UK. Would you be able to identify the amount of tax flight in that situation?
That's a separate question. We could certainly say at the end of the period for which that change related how much has come in, and I don't think that it would be materially different from the 99% of the total that we would expect. That might be more than it might be less than it had been the previous year, and that change will take into account a number of factors: changes in the economy, changes in the number of people employed, changes in the profitability of business, and will also have buried within it the question of whether people have chosen to take jobs in England rather than Scotland, or Scotland rather than England, as in response to the tax rates. We do quite a lot of work on trying to understand what's going on in the tax system. I mean, I think the only thing I could say with confidence is we'll never be sure, even well after the event, how much of any particular change was due to a change in tax rate or due to other economic factors. So it'll be very difficult to pin down what you call tax flight. And indeed, is it tax flight that somebody sitting in Northumberland, given the choice of a job in Edinburgh or Manchester, says, well, quite like the job in Manchester, it so happens the tax rate's lower or higher, and I'll take that into account. I mean, he or she probably doesn't know whether that's tax flight or not, and we certainly wouldn't.
That's right, and people have choice of residence in some cases as well. In another scenario, then, imagine the Scottish Government wishes to pursue a much more rigorous anti-tax avoidance strategy here in Scotland, and wishes to gain the benefits of being tougher on tax here in Scotland. Would you be able to identify the success of such a policy?
Well, first of all, you can only be tough on avoidance in relation to those taxes which you've got responsibility for, which will be the land and buildings tax and the landfill tax, and you can certainly do that. It's then a matter for Revenue Scotland whether that tough policy is or isn't producing results that. The UK Tax Administration will not adopt a different anti-avoidance strategy in relation to the taxes we are responsible for in Scotland: capital gains tax, inheritance tax, corporation tax, from what we do in England, and that will be true of income tax, and which is now comprised, or will now be comprised, of the Scottish rate as well as the English rate. So we will not be taking a different approach in relation to avoidance in Scotland from any other part of the UK. The Scottish Government might want us to, but that, under the current setup, is not something which you can tell us to do, and it's not something we would want to do. This is a national tax system, albeit the Scottish rate is embedded in part of the collection of that operation of that national tax system.
Okay, just again, for the purpose of hypothesis here, imagine the Scottish Government was not to rely on HMRC to pursue such a policy, but were to use other techniques or other policies. I can't imagine quite what they would be, but you know, given that Scotland prides itself on having a more collectivist approach, and we decide to pursue a more moral economy and encourage greater individual and collective responsibility here in Scotland, would you be able to assess and measure that?
That is seriously hypothetical, but look, there are all sorts of behavioural techniques you can apply for testing the consequences of, you know, these softer, what we tend to call upstream actions. I'm sure there are techniques you could apply to this seriously hypothetical question. Whether it would be appropriate for us to apply our resources to determining whether actions you have taken have had some impact on our tax collection is an interesting one. We might well be interested in it because we might think, well, that sounds like a good idea if ministers go around persuading everybody to pay their tax by giving, you know, tub-thumping speeches about how important it is, and that appears to have an effect. We might be interested because we might want to encourage others to do the same. So we might evaluate it, we might not. I wouldn't be over-optimistic that we'd be able to get particularly hard conclusions simply because this is an enormously difficult area to pin down consequences to actions.
Well, there could be other actions. I mean, insisting that everybody publishes their own tax details, for example. But anyway, I'll move off that.
Yeah.
I was just hypothesizing.
Sorry, I was just going to add that given that we're focusing on the 1% of income tax that isn't collected automatically, that the amount of that tax will be forecast by the Office of Budget Responsibility before the year starts. That will be the immediate effect on the Scottish Block Grant Adjustment. They will take account of any behavioural assumptions they might want to make about how the Scottish behaviour might affect the recoverability of that last 1%. Equally, we will then, a year after the end of the relevant year, in our accounts, we will make a final determination of the amount of revenue from the Scottish rate of income tax. Not all of that 1%, or most of that 1% won't have been collected at that point. We will have to make an estimate of the amount of that we would eventually collect. If there was a reason to think that that was different from the generality of the UK, then clearly we would take that into account, though I think we would expect, at the moment, the data we have is all at UK level, and we would expect to use UK level assumptions.
Yeah. No, I think that there's two issues. One is that we come to a fair assessment initially, but then that we have the ability to measure change. Should there be policy difference? And I think that's the key I was trying to establish. Can I just move on to accountability? Can I ask you, Mr. Morse, do you regard yourself, under the new system, will you be accountable to this Parliament and to this committee?
Well, I'll certainly be addressing a report to you. So, in that regard, yes. But I'm not. I'm not under your broader direction, obviously. But I would be, in regard to that, I would be making a report addressed to you, and I have a statutory pathway to enable me to do that now.
No, this amendment we're talking about clearly places a legal obligation on you to publish a report.
Yes.
But it doesn't give you. There's no legal obligation for you to appear before this committee, for example.
But I would. Well, that's true. But as a matter of fact, every time you've invited me so far, I would do, and I wouldn't worry about the legal obligation. I'd look. It would be very difficult for me to do other than to appear, and I certainly would always. I will give you my assurance that I and my successors would appear if you invited us.
Yeah. Well, just on that point, because I was interested by your comments earlier that you would clearly wish to expand on any observations in a narrative report. Would you expect to appear annually before the committee to talk about the report you publish annually?
That would be up to the committee, but if you asked me to come, I would.
Okay. And in terms of the relationship with the Auditor General in Scotland, there's no legal relationship, as I understand it, certainly not in this amendment. It's a relationship which will it be underpinned by a memorandum of understanding?
Absolutely. If that's appropriate, we'll be happy to enter into it. And in fact, it always would be appropriate, because in circumstances like this, you need to be very clear what everybody's terms of reference are.
Yeah.
However well you cooperate, you can't just rely on that. You need some clarity.
No, absolutely, yes. I think we need to know the limits, as it were. In this situation, so you expect to enter a formal memorandum of understanding. Would you expect, or maybe it might be a question for you, might be a question for Mr. Troup, would you expect the Auditor General for Scotland to have individual access to individual taxpayers' accounts, to be able to identify individual accounts?
No.
Specifically not?
No.
We've got no gateway to make those available to the...
At the moment, I'm right in thinking of Mr.
And can I just take you back one step in what you said? If you decide that you'd like some additional assurance from the Auditor General of Scotland on our work, I've already indicated I'll be happy to do it. I'm not recommending it or the opposite. I'm simply saying if that's what you decide you'd find helpful in whatever terms you'd find it helpful, I've indicated we'd want to be cooperative. Once we knew what that was and we worked out a practical way to make it work, we'd probably want to record that in a memorandum. So it's conditional on your wishing that in the first place.
Ah. There's a couple of issues, but the main one is just making sure, as a committee, we understand the legal limits, because clearly there's goodwill on both sides, but that's...
But once we've entered into a memorandum, then that would have an effect, and I wouldn't expect that anybody would be able to depart from that. And whether or not it's doesn't have statutory force, but it would certainly have strong moral force, and I think it'd be great difficulty in anybody not complying with it.
No, indeed. But as I say, this is a new relationship, and it's a tricky one to develop. Clearly, both HMRC and the National Audit Office are not accountable directly to this Parliament, and yet you are responsible for a lot of the revenue that we will be scrutinising in this committee. So it's a complex relationship that we have to make sure that we're clear about. And the role of the Auditor General in this is also an important one. It's very important for us, because the Auditor General is accountable to this Parliament. Would you, for example, Mr. Troup is actually the embodiment, and Ms. Walker, of a separate operation. HMRC have established a clear area within its organisation which is devolved, responsible for devolved taxes. Would the NAO authorise or appoint a person with individual responsibility for Scotland, or a devolved operation the way the HMRC has?
Before Amyas answers that, I mean, Sarah is responsible and I am responsible, but I wouldn't like you to think that we are part of a unit of HMRC which is labelled Scotland and nothing else. I mean,
you have other responsibilities.
I have a lot of other responsibilities, and Sarah has other responsibilities as well, which doesn't mean we're not devoting the right amount of resources, but we are not partitioning off part of the department and saying this is the Scottish bit of the department.
Yeah, no, which is quite reassuring. You're multitasking, but
efficient use of public resources.
But the key point here is that we know the HMRC that you are, the individuals, in fact, or your offices are directly responsible for Scotland. Would the NAO appoint such a person, or do you have in mind?
Well, we would, but and that person would change from time to time. So it's no different to any other, and we have a whole lot of different things we look at, and this would be one of them, and we'd have somebody nominated to lead on it, reporting to me, and that person would be identified to Audit Scotland, who would no doubt have somebody on their side who was also nominated to lead on it, and who would change from time to time. So that's just practically how things are arranged. That's how it would work. And if either of us found that, and if for example, Audit Scotland found that we were constantly changing the person, or it was unsatisfactory and they weren't able to get the assurance they wanted to, I'm sure that they'd let you know that, and they'd let us know that too. But as a generality, that's how we do our engagements. We don't just have a random, people have a continuing engagement, say develop some expertise, but on the other hand, it's important to have some rotation in what people do, so there's a balancing between those two things.
No, indeed, but HMRC have clearly taken a route and got a named person and a named officer. in charge of this area, but you haven't taken that stage yet.
But please bear in mind that as far as I am concerned, and I suspect it's just the same for the Auditor General of Scotland, this is a personal role, so the only person who's really accountable to you is me. To the extent that others are assisting me in doing work under my instructions, that's the way to look at it, not to think there's someone else that we can see as our primary point of contact. That, at a working level, that's a different matter.
Just one final question on this section, certainly. If there were differences of opinion between the Scottish Government and the UK Government about the level of tax raised in Scotland, what would be your role, Mr Morse, first, in commenting or resolving such differences? Would you have a role?
No, I don't think I would, because, I mean, my job would be to look at whatever, once those differences had worked themselves out, there would presumably be a rate to be applied, and then my job would be to comment on whether they'd been applied accurately and all the other things laid on me by the legislation, not to get involved in the policy discussion as to what the rate should be. That's none of my business.
But I think your question was not just about the rate, but presumably it was all about the amount. That, you know, we've paid over an amount, and you say actually it should be different. But even so, Amyas is either going to say he agrees with us or he agrees with you, which doesn't actually resolve the issue, because we could still end up with a difference between the Scottish Government and HMRC as the amount due. Clearly, you know, Amyas and the NAO's view on the right number might be pretty persuasive in that, but equally it might be a sort of more subtle part of the difference of view. In those cases, I think we just go back to the Memorandum of Understanding, because, you know, something under the Memorandum of Understanding would not have been performed in the way that one of the parties had expected, and you go back to the mechanism for escalation of disputes, which I've referred to, which ultimately goes up to the Joint Exchequer Committee and becomes a minister-to-minister matter between the two governments. And as I said to this committee when I was up here last year, I don't know what happens in those circumstances. It's well above my pay grade, but it would be resolved. It would have to be resolved minister to minister, government to government.
If you can, I'm so sorry, but just to be clear, and going back to reminding you of the response I gave to Mr Beattie earlier on, if I was concerned that there was something where there was a difference of understanding or some material issue was germane to understand in this committee, I would tell you that when I came to report to you. So it's not, we try and travel a pretty straight road. So if there was something like that we thought you needed to know about, even if we weren't able to resolve it, if we felt you needed to have information on something that you didn't have or didn't understand as well as we felt it might be helpful to you to understand, we would be very clear and explicit with you about it.
Just check, Mr Troup, do HMRC intend appearing annually before this committee?
Again, I was asked this before, and I think I said as long as you didn't call me up every week, I'd be very happy to come up, with reasonable frequency and to give an account of what we're doing, although I'm not directly answerable to the Scottish Parliament.
Thank you.
So just to clarify that, I think under the Memorandum of Understanding and the Scottish Government's November 2013 implementation update, HMRC would send an extract from its account covering all matters relating to the Scottish rate of income tax to the Scottish Parliament. Now, separately, we'll have the National Audit Office annual audit report, and that will be laid before Parliament. But there's a difference between sending something to the Parliament and laying it before the Parliament. So what would be the force of the report, of the extract report from HMRC?
That is part of the operational matter covered by the Memorandum of Understanding, which is between us and the Scottish Government, saying how we will actually administer the tax. And if you look at the Memorandum of Understanding, you will have seen that it contains a whole lot of provisions. I mean, in a sense, it's like a commercial agreement. We will do this. These are our obligations under the agreement. This is what will happen if there are disputes. These are the payments that you will make to us for the things we provide, and so on and so forth. We expect to comply with all of those things, and we have a good engagement with the Scottish Government already on that. But ultimately, if there is a breakdown of agreement on what's happening there, it is not for me to be summoned by the Parliament. It is a matter to escalate through the layers of governance.
Right. So,
sorry,
so you would be sending an extract of your accounts to the Scottish Government,
yep.
presumably a copy to the Scottish Parliament. Now, in terms of procedures, the National Audit Office report, if it's laid before the Scottish Parliament, gives this committee the opportunity to look at that. But we wouldn't necessarily have the right to look at something that you have simply sent to either the Scottish Government or the Scottish Parliament. No. It would require the Scottish Government to lay a report before the Parliament. So essentially, there is probably no way that we would be able to look at the reports that you are producing unless something else is done. And again, it would only be an extract of your account. So where would, if we have concerns about, you know, we can certainly talk to Mr Morse about his views on how HMRC is operating, but if this committee had concerns about the way that you were implementing or collecting or dispersing, we would have no way of being able to look at that formally.
Well, I'll let Sarah come in on the details, but I mean, I think there is an important point here that we have an agreement with the Scottish Government and we are performing, you know, for the Scottish Government, and they are in a sense managing the Scottish side of this agreement. I don't think we want to get into a situation, although probably they wouldn't want to get into a situation where, in a sense, you were managing the agreement, which is an agreement between us and them.
No,
but that doesn't mean we're not prepared to come and talk to you, because I'm very prepared.
But forgive me. There's a difference, and I'm quite clear in my own mind. There is a difference between managing an agreement and having political oversight of the way in which systems are operating. And as things stand, I can't see a mechanism for this committee to be able to comment on the effectiveness, the efficiency or the robustness of the processes, because there is no, I cannot see a formal mechanism for that being laid before Parliament and then to this committee.
Well, if it would be helpful for us to actually say that the formal reports that we put on the memorandum of understanding, that we do lay them before this Parliament, we're very happy to do that. I mean, I don't think it'll make any practical difference, because once we actually put those reports in, I'm very happy to come and talk to you anyway. But if it would reassure this committee, I'm very happy to say that we would lay, and I'm not quite sure what is connoted by that word lay, other than giving you a bit more of an ability to ask us questions.
No, but forgive me if it appears I'm being pedantic, but we actually do not have the authority to go into subjects that are not either laid by the Auditor General on behalf of Audit Scotland to the Scottish Parliament, or are laid by the Scottish Government. The fact that you have produced the report doesn't necessarily give us the authority to look at something, so there needs to be a way in which that would be triggered.
As I say, I'm not quite sure what the word lay connotes in this context. I'm happy to say that, I'm happy to lay, if that just means sending to you a copy of the report. But I think ultimately this is a matter for you to discuss with the Scottish Government in order to make sure that you've got what you need and they're happy with that. But I mean, I would repeat the undertaking that I'm always, not weekly, happy to come and talk to you.
We can certainly explore that further, because I think there does need to be a consistency between looking at what the National Audit Office is doing and also looking at what HMRC has been doing. Can I just clarify one point, and it might appear trivial? You talked earlier on about a difference between the Scottish rate and the English rate. Are there going to be differences then in Northern Ireland and Wales?
There is a proposal to give to the Welsh Government the power to introduce a similar Welsh rate of income tax, but that is a proposal only, which would have to be, I think, first adopted by the Welsh Government and then put to a referendum. There is no equivalent proposal in relation to Northern Ireland. So
until such times as Wales makes a decision, it will be Scotland and then the rest of the UK?
It will be.
Right, okay. Bob Doris.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'd echo the Convener's just almost, it sounds like pedantry, but in terms of laying a report, the committee's got a very strict remit which allows us, under our rules of engagement, to scrutinise or not scrutinise something, and the technical definition of laying just allows us to scrutinise in an appropriate manner and keep within our remit. So it seems pedantic, but it's quite important in terms of taking the work of the committee forward. Moving on, hopefully I'm not going to damn you with faint praise, but I'd written down cautiously reassured on my notes here. It would seem to be, at first look, that whilst tax systems can be complicated, actually, if you get the systems right, the mechanisms right, the tax codes right, it actually becomes incredibly simple, because if you've got the processes right, it just happens, and it's about getting the processes and the structures right. So hopefully you're doing that, and Mr Morse is part of the checks and balances and scrutinising that's done effectively. Some of the members have mentioned Audit Scotland in relation to where the checks and balances might lie in scrutinising what will be a UK-wide report on how income tax is collected in the nations and regions of the UK. Audit Scotland is an organisation we're obviously incredibly familiar with at this committee, and they lay quite detailed reports in front of us on a regular basis. Has the National Audit Office had detailed discussions with Audit Scotland in terms of how you might conduct a joint exercise when you are assuring yourself that the Scottish rate of income tax has been collected robustly, routinely, efficiently as part of that wider UK system? Because Audit Scotland, I'm sure, would have something meaningful to say as part of that process. So have discussions taken place in where Audit Scotland might fit into that process?
Yes, they have. I mean, they can always be more detailed once, you know, if it's clear that this is what you'd like to happen, then they'll probably take on yet another level of detail. I think it's quite important to emphasise how they might work, which is primarily, and I'm probably not going to put this as well as Audit Scotland would, primarily that we do most of the auditing, and that Audit Scotland would look over our shoulder and say, does this seem reasonable? Are you comfortable with it? It would be in kind of along those lines, which would be a very valuable reassurance to you, I think. And I think that's the most practical way for it to work. And that's broadly, and probably as I may not have done it full justice, but that's what I think the discussion has led us toward so far. And I am confident that that would, one, be very manageable, and two, I think it would be, I can see that that would provide you with a degree of reassurance, of assurance from Audit Scotland as well as from us. And I don't, as I said last year when I came, and I remain in that position, I'm more than happy to cooperate in any arrangements of that kind. It's not something which I view with any degree of, I have no reservations about doing something of that kind.
I suppose what I'm trying to tease out is whether or not Audit Scotland will audit the auditors, or whether they will sit within a piece of partnership work with the National Audit Office.
Well, they won't do all the same things we do, because they don't have statutory access to the records of HMRC, which we do have, and so they won't be able to do everything that we do, but they will be able to look at how we do it and be, which is very common among auditors. This is not some amazing new arrangement. This is something that often happens. We have group audits in the private sector. You very often have a group auditor and you have subsidiary auditors, and they satisfy each other that the work, that they can all take assurance from each other's work. I don't find this a difficult or odd procedure at all to put into effect. And it's one I think we could do in a way which you would find, seamless.
Right. Okay, that's helpful, but what I'm trying to tease out, and I accept everything you've said there, is you can have the National Audit Office and you can have Audit Scotland sitting down together, having discussions with the National Audit Office going, and I'm sure we'll hear from Audit Scotland in due course in relation to this, the National Audit Office saying, here's how we run these procedures, here's our audits, here's our mechanisms, here's how the Scottish rate of income tax fits in. What are your thoughts on that? And at that point, Audit Scotland could say, tickety-boo, looks good, we're happy with that. Or they might say, well, we might tweak it this way, or we might tweak it that way. Would you take that on board? And then you run your audit. That wouldn't be looking over your shoulder. That would be partnership working.
Well, that sounds pretty much like what I expect us to do.
Right.
Okay. So it's not like we do it and we tell them we've done it, is it all right? Mm-hmm. That would be that's not my idea of collaboration. What we would do would be to have a discussion with them, and this is normal in the auditing profession, to have a discussion with them about what we're proposing to do, what challenges and risks we saw in it, take on board any suggestions that they had that were germane. If we didn't agree with them, have a discussion about that and see what was practical and what wasn't, or what concerns they had, and then carry out the bits that only we could carry out according to what we'd agreed, and then explain what we'd done, what we'd found, and we go forward like that. So that's the sort of way we do it. I think which is pretty much what you said. I'm
still on this initial question because I'm just trying to tease out. I think
you're going to get much further.
I think you keep preempting where you think I'm going to go with my question, right? And what I'm trying to tease out is, so we've got that. You said that's kind of what I anticipate would happen. So Audit Scotland sits down with the NAO. NAO goes, well, and you work in partnership in many ways, I'm sure, already, and closely work together, so there's no turf war here. It's two respected organisations just getting on with it. And you say, look, here's how we're doing this UK tax audit and scrutiny. Here's how we lay our reports. The Scottish rate of income tax is on the horizon. Here's how that fits into it. At that point, Audit Scotland, as I was saying before, might go, fantastic, that's great, or they might say, maybe just a little bit more here, a little bit more there. So would Audit Scotland say that privately? Would they say that publicly? Would they give a seal of approval from Audit Scotland ahead of that? Or would they, and this was your expression, it wouldn't have been mine, would they look over the shoulder of you after you've done something and, if you like, audit the auditors? I'll just say a little bit more, because I think you've tried to make
I think when looking over the shoulder means while you...
Can I give you an example? This is important, right? I mean, Audit Scotland, let's go a bit tangential. Audit Scotland did quite a detailed audit of waiting lists in Scotland. One of the things that is into the health boards, and it said, right, shows your waiting list data, shows the computer systems, shows all the empirical evidence you've got, shows all the pathways, and they looked at it as auditors and said, and had something meaningful to say on that. In terms of where they would then fit in to the auditing of the Scottish rate of income tax, they wouldn't be getting access to that kind of data at taxpayer level. They wouldn't be able to run through what I feel like the internal systems of the National Audit Office were. So I would have an issue with that. I'm not sure if Audit Scotland are looking for this or not looking for this, but I'm just trying to think out loud.
Question of whether they're looking for it. They can't, statutory, they can't have it.
Absolutely.
So what we have to do is to find a way of working where they can be satisfied about it, that everything we've done is sound. So in other words, we talk about it beforehand, we talk about it as we're doing it, we talk about it after we're doing it. And if they had concerns, normally when you're doing something like this, if somebody has concerns and they express the concerns at an early stage, the chances of us overlooking those concerns or saying we don't, you know, if they say, well, why don't you do a bit more of this or that, or something we think you should do differently, we'd have a professional discussion about it, and most likely we would find some way of an agreed path, because people wouldn't be disagreeing for fun, they would be disagreeing for some technical professional reason. And therefore, you'd actually resolve that together. You come to a pathway that both could agree on. That's what I would expect. If they didn't agree on that, then they'd tell you so.
And I suppose the great thing about statute, Mr. Morse, is statutes can be changed. It just takes legislation to do so. So just because something can't be done doesn't mean it can't be done in the future. But I accept you operate to what the statute currently says, and that's the situation just now. I'm going to go back. I'm sorry for continuing with this very straightforward point. Okay, so let's look at it another way then. I've written down that on the 31st of January, the National Audit Office will lay a report, give a report, provide a report. That's the date for that. After that, there will be no statutory duty for the National Audit Office to come to this Parliament. But I'm delighted, and as the HMRC has as well, they've said, look, we're more than willing to come along. That might become an abstract argument of whether there should be a duty or not a duty to appear, but you've said you would do it, and I take that in the spirit it's intended. I'm sure Audit Scotland would do that as well. What would I'm trying to get what the dynamic of our scrutiny role would be. Would we anticipate Audit Scotland and the National Audit Office sitting at an evidence session here where we've got this report before us and we're having a conversation about Audit Scotland would say, yeah, we signed all this off before the National Audit Office ran their procedures and produced this report, so we're happy with it? Or would Audit Scotland say, well, we suggested this, we suggested that, we couldn't quite persuade HMRC or the National Audit Office to... I'm trying to tease out what the dynamic is.
It wouldn't be for Mr Morse to tell us what Audit Scotland proposes to do. I think he will be constrained in advising us what his role is. I think separately we could expect the Auditor General at some point in the future to indicate to us how she believes that she and Audit Scotland will operate, and we can consider that at that time.
I think that's absolutely right. Thank you very much, Chair. And the only thing I would say about it is this. I'd expect that we'd be as open as we possibly could about it. I mean, none of this would be there'd be a secret disagreement that you didn't know about. There's no interest in that. I have no interest in that at all. So what I would expect is that Audit Scotland, who have a very direct relationship with you, would be very forthright with you about what they thought about every aspect of it. And if you wanted us to sit and talk to you directly, fine. And if you wanted to talk to them separately to be assured that there was nothing that it would have said to you that it would like to have said if we weren't there or anything, you could have whatever procedures you wanted to be comfortable.
I have no further questions. I appreciate your forbearance with this line of question. It was really just the dynamic in terms of if Audit Scotland is involved at the coalface in terms of working with you in partnership over what your procedures look like, and then they have that's when you mentioned that expression, the over-the-shoulder look, how you can do both those things at the same time. But that's a dynamic we can discuss with Audit Scotland.
I just think what you take out of the phrase over-the-shoulder is a little different from what I do. Okay. But I'm simply trying, and I don't regard it as forbearance on my part at all. I just want to, I think it's something which is, this sort of cooperation is familiar to people in the accounting profession, and there are quite strong conventions about how you carry it out, and I don't find it strange or difficult that we will do it. I think, however, what I would urge the committee to do is whatever Audit Scotland says and whatever the Auditor General says that she wants to do, I would say all of this would be conducted with the committee on the most open and explicit basis. So you'd be aware of anything, any degree of friction or disagreement or anything unresolved, you'd be aware of. There's no desire on anybody's part to push anything on anyone. And I don't think you'd find that would occur.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Any other members? Can I clarify one or 2 points, Mr. Troup, on compliance issues? I had understood from what was being said that it would be difficult to separate the Scottish rate of income tax from national insurance and capital gains tax.
Capital gains tax, no. Capital gains tax is self-assessed, and so we can differentiate with some additional work on our systems capital gains tax compliance. Which
ones would it be? Scottish rate of income tax, national insurance, anything else?
The Scottish rate of income tax, the rest of income tax and national insurance are all collected together through the PAYE system.
Right.
And that is why it is very difficult to disaggregate the impact of compliance activities on individual taxes, and because it's through employers as well, it's very difficult to disaggregate the impact of compliance activities between those three different elements.
So how would you then separate out the amount collected through the Scottish rate of income tax and the national insurance?
In the normal way, when from a compliant taxpayer, it will be very clear. Through PAYE, it will be separately identified in the way that I described with the S code. Through self-assessment, it will clearly be part of the self-assessment process will be to identify the person as a Scottish rate taxpayer or not, and that will allow us to do this. I think what we're talking about is the compliance activity after the end of the year where that hasn't worked. with an employer when we settle for at the end of a compliance inquiry, we will usually settle for a single amount and not necessarily disaggregate that between tax and national insurance. And sometimes for a self-assessment inquiry, we won't always separate out the different elements, which might include capital gains tax in some circumstances. So it is at the point where, probably after the 1 year point where we've struck that final figure for the revenue from the Scottish rate, we will still be doing compliance inquiries. Some of those will have an element which will be the Scottish rate. We will estimate that at the 1 year point.
Okay. And do you believe that you will have access to clear and reliable data?
From employers or for Scottish taxpayers? Sorry.
Well, both from employers and clear and reliable data which refers to Scottish taxpayers.
I mean, I think so, subject to sort of picking up some of the caveats which Amyas gave in relation to the identification of taxpayers. You know, we're dealing in aggregate with 40-something million individuals across the UK and probably 2.6 million in Scotland. You know, there are always at the margins uncertainties because individual circumstances change, taxpayers die, businesses come in and go out of existence. But I think there's no reason to think that the data that we have for Scottish taxpayers will be any less clear and accurate than for any other subsection of the population that we have to deal with.
Okay. You mentioned earlier on the timetable for the implementation. I think Sarah Walker had spoken about the IT systems, and probably from April this year you would be starting that work, and you believed it would be in place in time. What are your other key milestones for the implementation of the Scottish rate of income tax?
I want to add, but I think we have to get our own internal processes in place to cover some of the things we've described. But the biggest, in terms of volume of people and activities, is the identification of Scottish taxpayers, which again, as we've discussed in this committee before, is something we do not propose to do until we are well into 2015, although, and there is discussions about the communications plan with the Scottish Government, you know, we will build up to that with some sort of communications plan before we, in terms of advertising and publicity, before we actually go out to engage directly with individuals to confirm or otherwise that they're Scottish taxpayers. And that will be the biggest activity. And coming back to the very beginning of this session, in a sense, once we've done that, most of the other activities are behind the veil, as it were, so far as the public's concerned, because it's then just us a matter of us making sure that the IT systems are in place in order to make sure that the consequences of being a Scottish taxpayer are reflected in PAYE codes and are picked up in receipts. So that is by far and away the biggest activity, and why the start-up costs for this are quite significant because of the amount of effort required to identify the 2.6 million taxpayers.
Okay. You say that the start-up costs are significant. Have you identified how much it will be?
We're going to give an update, I think, in April. We haven't changed our estimate of 40 to 45 million, but you know, I'd like to be cautiously reassuring that we don't expect it to be more than that, and you can read into that a little bit of optimism that actually we hope it will be below that.
And the Scottish rate of income tax will be applicable from the start of the tax year 2016-17, yep. So that's what, 5th of April,
yep, 5th
or thereabouts.
Yep.
When will the decision need to be taken about whether the Scottish Government would set a different rate of tax in order for that to kick in for the start of that tax year?
Well, it absolutely has to be made before the beginning of the tax year.
Yes.
The timetable envisages it being by November the 30th the previous year. And again, and sorry, it may have been with the Finance Committee rather than this committee, we had some discussion last year on this. Although it does not have to be made by November 30th, if it is not, we will not be able to issue the coding notices on time, and that has consequences for the employers. And while we can reissue coding notices, and I'm afraid we do from time to time, either because governments change decisions or whatever, that will have cost implications, and as those will be costs directly referable to a decision in relation to the Scottish rate, they would come back to you. So as long as we have a decision by the 5th of April, we can implement it. If we don't have it by 30th November, it will cost more and create more visible disruption because people will be getting more than one coding notice than if we do have it by 30th November.
In terms of good practice,
best practice is 30th November.
Although our budget process, budget time scale is different, so that will have implications in the way that the government determines its budget in the way that this
we understand that. And obviously it is open to the government to decide not to make a decision until 1st of March or whatever, but we would then be clear as to what the cost and operational consequences were.
Colin Keir, sorry I missed you.
Thanks, Convener. Actually, in fact, quite a lot of it's been covered. One of the things that I'm still a bit shaky on is what's effectively a geographic tax, but there is no geographic way really that you're setting up at this minute other than through the tax codes. And perhaps if there is a future settlement, shall we say, that keeps things as they are politically, and we have to go forward with this, how would you see the dispute resolution mechanism should there be a dispute between any future Scottish government within a devolved settlement? If there is a complaint that they don't feel that the figures are right or whatever, how would that be manifested through in terms of reporting through the system, the NOA, and is there any position that Audit Scotland might have in a reporting mechanism?
I don't want to cut this short, but in a sense I think we have covered that fairly thoroughly, although a bit slightly fragmented in the previous answers. Those disputes would ultimately be disputes between us and the Scottish Government about the operation of the Memorandum of Understanding, and as I've said, would be escalated up ultimately to the Joint Exchequer Committee to become a minister-to-minister issue between the two governments.
Right, okay. It's just that with being fragmented and perhaps not taking in some of the things that were said, I do appreciate that. It's really just a case of being clear in my own mind. The fact that as an organisation we have a Scottish rate of income tax, but it doesn't appear to be that short of just the coding, there's no equivalent set. I know you have mentioned it before, and I'm trying to see the difficulties there are in terms of how that would be reported. I haven't quite settled in my own mind that, but that's my problem is.
Well, this is an unusual and novel arrangement. There may be other countries in the world that do something similar, but it's certainly the first time we've done something like this within the United Kingdom. And I think it's quite important conceptually that you as representatives understand it, because ultimately the residents of Scotland have got to understand what's going on here as well. So, and that may come back to our publicity and communications campaign in 2015. You will not want to alarm Scottish residents and voters that they're somehow paying some new tax, and so I think there are some interesting communication challenges in getting over exactly what is happening here, given that there isn't going to be much visible unless and until you change the rate, but we are going to have to do quite a lot. So,
yeah, I'm thinking just in terms of the assessments from the various ministers, in terms of looking forward to their budgets.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, Sarah.
I was just going to, without making this any more complicated, I think it's important to distinguish between any disagreement about the correctness of the amount we report in our accounts, which I think is about our accounts and about the opinion of the NAO, and then separately a disagreement between ministers about the amount that gets passed on to the Scottish Government, which is through the block grant mechanism, and that's the decision that I think would get escalated through the
keep it to sort of auditing matters here, and not drifting into finance committee stuff. So, thank you.
Okay. Can I thank you, Mr Morse, Mr Troup and Sarah Walker for attending the committee. It's a very technical issue. It can be a very dry issue, but it's clearly one of huge significance, both for Scotland and for the rest of the United Kingdom, and I don't doubt that it's something that both this committee and Parliament will be returning to. And it is new territory, as you explained, Mr Troup. It's never been done here before. With that in mind, I realise that we're in a kind of interim situation. But thank you for your contribution this morning.
And I think cautiously reassuring is the right message to leave. Rather better than being gung-ho, I think.
I think Mr Doris is a frustrated civil servant by the sound of that language. Okay, thank you. Okay, if we could move on now to the next item on our agenda, Section 23 report on Scotland's key transport infrastructure projects. We have a response from the Scottish Government on the Auditor General for Scotland's report, and we also have, I think, a report in the new format coming in the spring. So can I ask members whether they believe that there's any further action required on this? I would have thought it's a question of noting and referring to the Infrastructure Committee. Ken McIntosh?
Yes, clearly this came out of a series of meetings and reports, and marked a welcome change of attitude from Sir Peter Housen, apart from anyone else. However, there's one particular item that's missing, and that's any comment on the 5% limit that the government sets on future borrowing. It's quite an important issue. There was supposed to be further detail. There was further detail in Mr Stoney's budget statement in November, but there's no. It's not included here. It's a sort of parallel issue, but it was commented on by the Auditor General at the time, and in the key infrastructure projects report, and I think she illuminated that although we're giving some information, it's not broken down in such a way that we can actually scrutinise it. In other words, there was a graph, for example, which showed the government's estimate of future spending remaining under the 5%, but then you weren't given the information to be able to check that or audit that. There's various question marks about how the 5% is agreed. It doesn't include, part of it doesn't include local government commitment, for example. It includes resource but not DEL in the way it's calculated. So there's a number of issues about it which I think at the very least need to be explored with the Cabinet Secretary, and I was just wondering what the mechanism would be for that.
My understanding is that that will be addressed in the new format, and we will be seeing that in, is it March? I'll bring in Jane, the clerk, to the committee.
Certainly the information regarding the 5% target that appeared in the end of last year's in the budget documents and the annex to those, and I understand that the intention is the government will, in its budget report each year, include an annex indicating that 5% and where it runs in terms of current commitments for major capital projects.
Well, I agree. It's been published in this year's budget documents, so it's there now. What I'm suggesting is that I would have thought that we would wish to exercise some sort of audit scrutiny over those figures. At the moment, the process for doing so is not quite clear to me because the figures themselves do not allow further scrutiny. They are top-level figures and they don't have a breakdown. And what I'd like to be able to do is trying to establish, even if we don't scrutinise, if the Auditor General had greater access to the information to be able to scrutinise those figures, the basis for reassuring Parliament that we're not exceeding a 5% target that's been set by the government, I think that would be useful. It seems to be part of this infrastructure, major capital projects issue, and I just wanted to check how we're going to take it forward. We can't just, I wouldn't wish to just move on from it now and think it's done. I'd just like to know, are we going to explore it further? Are we going to ask? I would suggest, for example, that we write to the Cabinet Secretary, ask whether or not he will provide further information either to us or, more importantly, to the Auditor General, so that we can provoke further analysis. Well, we can certainly see
further clarification on that point from either the Cabinet Secretary or Sir Peter Housen or relevant accountable officer, so we can certainly seek clarification on that.
Okay. And one other point, if I can, which is the new reporting mechanism on major capital projects includes the new hubcos. and the work of the Scottish Futures Trust. But of course, the trouble with the hubcos and the Scottish Futures Trust is they are not subject to audit scrutiny. So it's a slightly unsatisfactory situation, and it's clearly welcome that we get that information, and we're provided with assurances, I suppose, put it that way, about the progress of these projects and the spend on them. But we then don't have a mechanism, as I understand it, to take that any further again. So, in other words, we can't then ask Scottish Futures Trust for an explanation. We can't ask them to open their books. So again, I would quite welcome the opportunity to explore with the government their thoughts on our role. They're providing us with information, but we are frankly quite limited in the questions we can ask of it. If we had any questions about those projects, who do we direct them to? Would we expect the Scottish Futures Trust, for example, to come and give evidence in any sense about the progress? I mean, these are we're talking about £2.5 billion worth of public money here, so it's substantial sums of money. So again, it's don't get me wrong, I'm very pleased that they're now reported on a regular basis, but just having them reported with no audit is a bit odd.
Yeah, I think there's two issues. We could certainly ask the question about how the Scottish Government believes that should be scrutinised. But in terms of initiating further action, I think perhaps we need to speak further with Audit Scotland, because we can't initiate any inquiry or investigation at our own hand, and it would depend on the work which Audit Scotland does. So we can certainly seek clarification from Audit Scotland about how, and the Auditor General, about how Audit Scotland intends to look at that, and we can certainly ask the Cabinet Secretary how he would, or he or she, I'm not sure which Cabinet Secretary is it Nicola Sturgeon? Whichever, how they believe that there should be scrutiny and accountability in relation to those projects, but I'm quite clear that we can't initiate any work ourselves. Okay?
Okay.
Tavish Scott?
I had exactly the same two issues, and
right.
As long as they're taken forward, that's fine.
Okay, well, just hold the decision on that just now until we get the clarification that was sought, and we can decide at the next meeting, hopefully. Okay? Thank you very much. Can I suggest that we take a break before we get into item 4 on the Audit Scotland Performance Audit Programme of 2014 and suspend the meeting for a few minutes? reconvene the meeting. Item 4 on our agenda is the Audit Scotland Performance Audit Programme of 2014. And can I welcome to the committee the Auditor General for Scotland and Fraser McKinlay and Angela Cullen. Can I invite the Auditor General to brief the committee?
Thank you, Convener. We're grateful to have the chance to brief the committee today on the programme of performance audits for 2014, being prepared for me and the Accounts Commission by Audit Scotland. As the committee is aware, the performance audit programme is part of the wider public audit model that we carry out across Scotland, together with annual audits of Scotland's public bodies, overview reports of particular sectors like health and further education, best value reports on councils, audits of community planning partnerships, and reports on the National Fraud Initiative. The performance audit reports are an important part of the work of Audit Scotland, and one that this committee is most familiar with, I think. They underpin the committee's role in holding public bodies to account for their use of public money. They support improvement in public services, and they're used by the public sector and other bodies in developing their own strategies. That means that the way in which we develop the programme is a big part of our work and is important for us, and something that we put a lot of attention and resources into. It involves considering a wide range of information and intelligence to help us select the audits that are most relevant and will most add value, building on the close links between Fraser McKinlay and his team, who lead our performance audit work, and the auditors who carry out the annual audits of over 180 of Scotland's public bodies, so that we're clear on the key risks that the public sector faces. Members of the public also raise with us issues of interest and concern directly, which we take seriously, and we keep up to date with developments in public policy, review national statistics about performance, and talk regularly to the Scottish Government and people working across the public sector about the challenges they face and the way they see public services developing in future. This activity is an important part of our work and helps us make sure the performance audit programme is relevant and really adds value in areas that matter to people across Scotland. The 2014 performance audit programme reflects the environment in which the public sector is operating, including obviously continuing financial pressures, growing fiscal autonomy, demographic change, public sector reform, and the priorities of the Scottish Government. The programme also focuses very carefully through the lens of our own 4 audit dimensions, which are our particular way of looking at public services, focusing on financial sustainability, the transparency of financial and performance reporting, governance and financial management, and value for money. We believe that the programme that's set out in your briefing paper gives a good balance across the public sector, focusing on the big issues and the risks that it faces. We've taken a strong focus on public finances and economic growth through areas like education, skills and investment. And we've also included audits that will follow up issues raised in previous audit work to help measure improvement and impact. You'll see that the paper before you covers the full range of performance audits, including those that Audit Scotland carries out in local government on behalf of the Accounts Commission, and the audits that are carried out jointly for me and the Commission. The committee can expect to hear evidence from us on the performance audits that are carried out either for me as Auditor General or jointly for me and the Commission. And these include an update on A&E performance, a report on self-directed support, a report on local progress against our last public finances report, a final report on Glasgow's Commonwealth Games later this year, and a report on course efficiency. I'll also bring overview reports to the committee on the NHS and colleges later in the year, and I'll brief the committee on other work done on my behalf when that's appropriate, particularly any issues arising from the annual audits of public bodies. These audits are those that will be undertaken during 2014, and we plan to publish 4 reports by the end of June 2014, with the remainder being published by the end of March next year. We are, of course, as everybody is, mindful of the independence referendum later this year and the related moratorium on publications, and that means that we don't plan to publish reports between mid-July and the September referendum, although audit work will obviously continue during this period. We've highlighted indicative timings for publication in the appendix to your paper today. It's also worth noting that we aim to keep the programme flexible so that we can respond to any significant issues of public interest that may arise during the year, and that means the programme may be subject to change. Finally, Convener, this committee plays a vital role in ensuring that public bodies are held to account for their use of public money. We're always keen to hear the committee's views on our planned areas of audit work and on any topics that you'd like us to consider including in future programmes. Developing the programme, as I've said, is an ongoing process, and it would be good to come back to the committee later in the year to get your thoughts on potential topics past 2014. But at this stage, Convener, we'd be happy to answer any questions you and your colleagues may have about the programme and the future direction of our work.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask whether you will be looking from a performance audit perspective at how effective the changes to Scotland's colleges has been or have been?
That's certainly on our radar, Convener. You'll know that through the annual overview reports we've produced in the last 2 years on the audits of the individual colleges, we've kept a clear focus on the objectives of reform and the way in which the changes being made are moving towards them. We will be keeping an eye on the right point at which we should step back and look at the overall value for money that's being achieved and the success with which the government's objectives are being implemented. I'm not in a position yet to give you a firm date for that, but it's certainly something which continues on our radar.
Okay. You list the Accounts Commission as doing some work on school education. Now, given the significance of education to this Parliament, is that something that this committee then would have the opportunity to look at, given that it's Accounts Commission?
I'll ask Fraser to answer that as Controller of Audit, reporting on local government to the Accounts Commission.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, as we have done in the past, I'm sure if the committee would like the Accounts Commission to come and do a briefing on that audit, they'd be delighted to do so. So at the appropriate point, if you would like the Accounts Commission to give a briefing on that report, I'm sure that would be fine.
Yes, I have 2 issues excuse me, that I wanted to raise. And the first one is under the Accounts Commission, so probably Fraser, borrowing and Treasury management. It's always shocked me that, you know, all the time I've been in this Parliament, that local government can virtually, according to the SIPFA Prudential Code, basically borrow as much as they want. I have to say, secondly, I'm very concerned about the levels of council borrowing and debt in the Highlands, and I'm even more concerned about the amount of money that council taxpayers pay in interest, which gets bigger every year, and it's obviously less money for council services. I don't have an update on this, but on a previous parliamentary question, I know there was a different way of accounting from 2010, so I'm just going from there. But between 2010-11, the increase in local government borrowing was about £1 billion. I don't have the up-to-date figures, but given how cautious we are everywhere else, within Scotland, within Scottish budget efficiency savings here and there, you know, at what stage would you be concerned at the level of local government debt? I mean, my last figure here is 14 billion in 2011. I appreciate I'm not up to date, but I'm personally concerned. But at what stage would Audit Scotland or the Accounts Commission raise concerns about the increasing level of debt and no limits on it whatsoever?
In a sense, Mrs Scanlon, that's exactly why the Accounts Commission have asked us to look at this topic. For the last couple of years in the Accounts Commission's Local Government Overview Report, which in the past we have routinely brought to you for a briefing, and again be delighted to do that again this year in the spring, we have tracked that increase in borrowing and levels of debt in councils, and it's been very marked. And in fact, last year the Accounts Commission called on SIPFA to review the Prudential Code for borrowing, because our sense was it was set, I forget exactly when, but quite a long time ago now, and the world was a very different place. So that was exactly, in a sense, one of the reasons and of what Caroline was talking about in terms of using our local audit work feeding into a national performance audit bit of work looking at exactly this topic for exactly those reasons. So
the debt was 14 billion in 2011. What was the debt for 2013?
I'm afraid I don't have that to hand, Mrs Scanlon, but we can certainly provide that. And all of that stuff, the local government overview for this year will be publishing in February, so it'll all be in there.
That's very helpful, thank you. I'm pleased you're keeping an eye on it and that you share some of the concerns that I have. Convener, I've just got one other point.
Sorry, there's just one further question, and again it relates to the question asked about education. You know, historically, the performance of local councils is not something that this committee has been able to look at, even where the accounts of a council have not been signed off. But given the generality of this report, would we be able then to scrutinise the bigger picture in Scotland?
In a broad sense, you can scrutinise it in it, as we have done for certainly as long as I've been involved in it. The Accounts Commission come and give you a briefing on the local government overview. The difference, obviously, between that and a report you have from Caroline is what the committee can then do with it on the back of that. It is a briefing as opposed to you being able to take further evidence on it. But, as I say, we'd be very happy to come and do a briefing on that report once it's been published in February.
It's how far we can go. You know, clearly we're not there to hold an individual council to account, but if there were examples of one council behaving in an exemplary fashion, then that's something that I think we would want to hear about. But equally, if there were councils who were behaving in a very risky fashion, then I would have thought that that's something that would be worthy of further comment, and it's not specifically about holding individual councils to account. So it's where we move from a briefing to a more detailed scrutiny on an issue of wider concern.
At the moment, that responsibility, as you know, Convener, sits with the Accounts Commission rather than with this committee. And I think there are good and understandable reasons for that, given the separate democratic line of accountability that councils have. There clearly is a grey area in the middle between the overall picture of local government and the way that feeds back into the Scottish Government's responsibilities. So I think a briefing is the right way into it, but it's probably an issue to keep under review as the committee plans its work for the future.
Okay,
yes, my second point is we've actually heard quite a bit about the new single police force, and I think rightly so, and I've certainly welcomed that information. But the integration of the single fire and rescue service seems to have gone under the radar. I note that you're bringing forward a report this winter, which will be almost 2 years since the merger took place. Now, I would just draw your attention to this document, which is the best I could get, on the fire service, and it's an overview of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, which was done in October. Now, in the summary, well, I'll just read it out. During the development of this inspection report, we paid particular attention to the former Highlands and Islands Fire and Rescue Service. Now, I raised many concerns, I've no doubt Davy Scott did as well, but there are serious concerns there that we're not even going to hear what's happening. If I can just say, identified a number of issues that require ongoing monitoring to ensure special measures are put in place. There is operational risk information available to firefighters has not yet reached a satisfactory standard. The current service-wide project to address the issue should be encouraged and resources made available, and it's not yet clear that the service will be able to deliver a permanent increase in training. Now, I have heard from people within frontline firefighters, they are worried. They are worried about training, and as an Highlands and Islands MSP, I would be failing in my duty if I didn't bring this to your attention. Now, I would actually be given the information we have on the police. Fraser will know there was a very critical report, Convener, on Highlands and Islands Fire and Rescue Service prior to the merger, and that, in fact, personnel were brought from Grampian, Tayside and Lothian to help the service. And my concern, as highlighted in this report, is that it's floundering again. It's not getting the support that it needs, and there are operational risk factors. And if you forgive me saying so, it's almost on the back burner here, given that we've heard so much about the police integration. This is equally an emergency service that I think we all feel very passionate about, and I think we should be concerned if they don't have the resources and there are operational risks here. So my question, Convener, is why do we have to wait 1 year and 9 months in order to get a report on the reform of fire and rescue, particularly in relation to the Highlands and Islands, given that we've had so much on the police?
The answer, Mrs Scanlon, is that you don't necessarily. What we've set out in the paper is an either-or choice, which I'm in the process of making at the moment, between doing a follow-up piece of work on the police reform agenda or moving on to have a look at fire instead. At the moment, having sat down with the team and done our own review of the recent work we've done on police, my thinking is tending towards doing something on fire, and if we make that decision, it will be winter of this year that we'll be reporting on it. You'll see on page 6 of the paper.
Well, I know, but it's still a year and 9 months after the merger, whereas, you know, we've had a lot of information on police merger, but I'm highlighting concerns here. And
It really is a matter, I think, of focusing in on where we can add value. There clearly are some issues, as you said, in Highlands and Islands particularly, but also across the fire service. There were some significant challenges to deal with in bringing the single fire service together in the same way as there have been with police and specific professional issues. And we're starting work now, I think, really to make sure we're in a position to provide some assurance to the committee, provide more information about how that's going towards the back end of this calendar year. Angela, I think, wants to add to that.
Yeah, just to add to that, we work closely with the inspectorates in this area, and we were very aware that the HMFSI were doing that overview report.
It's the inspectorate that's raising the concerns.
Yes, and we were very aware that they were doing that work, and we agreed that the timing we would allow them to do that overview work to help develop their work programme for what they were going to go in and do individual inspections on, and also we might then come in on the back of it and do a review of fire reform. And that the timing was deliberate, as the Auditor General says. We don't necessarily need to wait until December this year to publish a report, but we certainly didn't want to start it until...
So given the serious concerns that have been raised about Highlands and Islands by the Fire Inspectorate, are you considering doing something earlier than December this year?
I think it's worth pointing out, Mrs Scanlon, that even if we were to publish a report in the winter of this year, we'd obviously be doing the work a good bit earlier than that. So, it's probably not that far away in terms of when we would actually be doing the work if Caroline decides that that's what we want to do. Again, just to give you some assurance, that report by Stephen Torrey, HMI for Fire and Rescue, and his team included some of my team, so they were involved in the work. And as you say, I did the report in Highlands and Islands, and so we're very aware of that. I think it's also worth just mentioning that a lot of the issues in Highlands and Islands are pretty operational in nature, and the revamped and, if you like, beefed up HMI for Fire and Rescue is the lead scrutiny body, if you like, for issues of operational fire and rescue. That's their, they're the professionals, they know what they're talking about.
Did you mention resources as well?
And our interest is, as you say, in reform, the extent to which reform would be meeting the objectives set out, how the money's been used and those kinds of things. So it's kind of complementary, and as Angela said, the issue for us was making sure that we weren't kind of falling over each other as we're doing the work. But it's just, again, to give you some assurance, very firmly on our radar, and we're working very closely with colleagues in HMI to think about how and when we go about the audit.
Bob Doris.
Thank you very much, Convener. I was going to make a couple of comments in the self-directed support piece of work that's in the programme. I should declare an interest, first of all, Convener, in relation to Glasgow region, where I represent. Glasgow City Council are involved in ongoing plans to close 3 day centres for adults with learning difficulties, and I've been involved in the campaign against that, and self-directed support has been cited, in my case, wrongly in relation to the closure of those 3 centres. But I just wanted to put that on the record as having an interest there. I should have, of course, scrutinised the legislation at Health Committee as well when it went through Health Committee. So it's in that context I'd like to say that I'm very keen that this report is published, and that we learn where there's best practice in introducing self-directed support across the country, and other areas learn from that best practice. But a concern that some local authorities, and I'm widening it out beyond my own local authority, may be deliberately conflating personalisation with self-directed support. And in the case of some local authorities, that's always been forced direct personalised budgets and a withdrawal of a local authority service. It's just, I would hope that when the audit is reported in relation to that, I'm sure it will be finessed in such a way to tease out the differences between what is personalisation, what is a local authority cut to resource allocation budgets, and what is actually self-directed support. Because in my direct experience, including in parts of Glasgow, but unfortunately not the whole of Glasgow, where it works, it can work very well. But I think you will find it a difficult audit to work out what is self-directed support, what are financial decisions made by local authorities that flows through the resource allocation system, and what is local authority priorities separate from self-directed support. I'm not sure if there's a question in there, Ms Gardner, but I think it's really quite important for me to put that on the record. I think my constituents in Glasgow would wonder why I wasn't putting that in the record when this was coming up at committee. And I really do look forward to that particular report, because I think all local authorities have to learn from best practice where it is, in local authorities where there's not such good practice, which could be anywhere in the country, have to quickly improve their game because vulnerable people are losing out.
It kind of feels as though you've been sitting in on the meetings my team have been having as they've been scoping out the work and agreeing what data they need to be able to answer those questions. The policy of self-directed support is obviously a clear policy by government. The implementation of that is made more difficult at a time of falling budgets and rising demand and all the rest of it. One of the things I hope we can add is a bit more clarity about the way it's being tackled in different parts of the country, to identify good practice in exactly the way you've described, but also to identify the things which people aren't doing as well as they need to. It is a complex area, and I hope we will be able to shine a bit of light on the way it's working so far and help to make suggestions for improvement in future.
Very much.
On that point, Christina McKelvey.
Thanks very much, Convener. I've got a very keen interest in self-directed support issue as well. I've got very active involvement with the South Lanarkshire Self-Directed Support Network, who are finding it increasingly difficult to deal with the local authority that they're with. And one of the things that I've seen from the areas that you would look at would be whether there's a positive impact, whether there would be more choice and more control, whereas what I'm seeing is less choice, less control, and people being priced out of care packages. Therefore, they can't afford them and they have to go back to the local authority, whereas what the local authority is offering is not actually what the person needs. I've witnessed situations where people have been basically told what they'll get, and there's been no negotiation or consultation or issue with that. And one key element of it is there's an issue around about equal pay for care staff, whether they're in a semi-arm's length private company or third sector company, or they're with the local authority. There's a real issue about equal pay across the care staff there. It's becoming a huge gap now, which is causing real problems when you go to finance or to price a care package. There's real issues there. And what I really wanted to know is, obviously you'll consult the local authorities, but will there be room for consultant actual service users and carers who are finding something that they thought would make their life easier, making their life actually much, much more difficult?
Absolutely. In all the work we do, we always build in as much as we can of the voice of the people who use services and are affected by them. It's a shame Angela Canning's not here today, the Assistant Director responsible for this piece of work. She could give you more detail on how we're doing it for this specific one, but it's a commitment we make in general and is obviously particularly important for this type of service that has such a direct impact on people's lives.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Colin... Do you want to come in, Colin?
Yes.
Yep.
Just a couple of points. You mentioned colleges, and I think that I remember around this table that we did raise concerns about how these trusts, these independent trusts, were going to operate. Yes. And I'm talking from memory here, but I think the Auditor General may have said that she was going to have a look at that in the future. Is that going to be part and parcel of looking at the colleges?
There's two ways of answering that. The convener asked about potentially a sort of wider-ranging performance audit of the college reform programme, and that's certainly under consideration for the future. But in this year, we'll be auditing the accounts of all of the colleges and the merged colleges as they come through, and as part of that, looking at the decisions they've made about arm's-length trusts and the option of either opting into the umbrella trust being set up by the Funding Council or doing something at a local level. You'll get that update later this year in our report on the college's 12-13 accounts, which are just being signed off at the moment.
Won't you have bit of a problem there as far as the trusts themselves are independent and not. I don't know if they're going to have any public funding in there, but as separate entities and arm's length entities, Audit Scotland will have a bit of difficulty, I would think, getting in.
That is one of the issues around the trusts themselves, but we will have access to the college's finances and accounts and to the funding, if any, assuming there will be some that's transferred into those accounts at the point when the new classification starts to have an impact at the end of this year. So we will be able to give you some information about it, although as you heard in great detail at the end of 2013, there will be some limitations around that because of the structure that's been chosen. It'll be interesting to see how that works. The other one was in the borrowing and treasury management for local government. I seem to recall that when we did a recent report, there was a concern about a long-term funding gap with the councils. And I'm struggling here to remember what it was, but apparently it was to do with housing, I think. But funding requirements arising from housing. It did not affect housing associations for some reason. Maybe because they do their funding a different way, but for the councils there was a very substantial gap some years down the line, and I think we were told that COSLA were aware of it, and that Audit Scotland had been in touch with COSLA, and COSLA were looking at what was going to happen. I would hope that would form part of this, because obviously if there is a long, regardless of whether it's in relation to housing or not, it's a long-term issue in terms of the liabilities of the council, and will have to be funded from someplace. You're right, Convener, it was in relation to our report on housing, and I think it's potentially relevant both to this piece of work and to Fraser as Controller of Audit and the Commission's continuing interest in the financial sustainability of local government. Do you want to add to that, Fraser?
Not much, Caroline. I think I'm equally trying to remind myself of that discussion, Mr. Beattie, but there was definitely something in there. I think the primary focus of the piece of work around borrowing treasury management is looking at how councils do it. So actually having a pretty thorough look at treasury management policy, process, the points at which they are deciding to borrow more money, how is that process done. So I'm not sure, just to manage expectations, that we'll get into a lot of detail about specific service delivery areas, if you like. I suppose the councils would probably also argue that one of the reasons that they are borrowing more is to invest in things and to build stuff. And so there's an interesting question for us about, well, what is the money being used for, and also bearing in mind that as much as their debt's going up, they also have some pretty significant assets to back it up. So it's trying to get a picture of that in the round, I think, on this project. Like the housing report, like some others, it may actually indicate some other areas of interest for us in more specific terms. But it will be a look at how treasury and borrowing management happens across the piece mainly.
Ken McIntosh.
I've got a couple of issues to mention. First, though, I don't know if you were able to hear the conversation on the previous item about the committee and your own work in scrutinising the £2.5 billion invested through the HubCos, scrutiny of the Scottish Futures Trust, and also further audit of the 5% cap on long-term investment. I was wondering your thoughts on those issues.
The committee might recall the report that I published, I think, in June last year on developing financial reporting in Scotland around the same time as the report on transport infrastructure projects. And the big message coming out of that really was that there is scope, particularly as our financial autonomy increases, to develop more transparency about the investment programme and commitments against revenue financing for capital purposes. I'll be following that up initially through the audit of the Scottish Government in 2013-14 directly, and then thinking about the best way of building on that report and the transport infrastructure report in reporting to this committee. But it's certainly something that's on my radar and that you'll be hearing more about over the months and years ahead.
Very good. That would also include the 5% cap as well.
The whole transparency of the way those investment decisions are made and what the long-term consequences are, I think, is very much on the radar.
Excuse me for not knowing this, but well, actually, before going to that, can I just double check? We receive regular reports under the major infrastructure audit report. On the fourth crossing, the Southern General and so on, do you conduct separate audits, or is that, do you audit those? We get reports from the Scottish Government. Do you also have an input in any way to those, or do you have an ongoing audit process, or do you have to audit them separately at the end of the whole process?
I audit all of that investment through the body which spends the money, if you like. So a lot of the transport investment goes through Transport Scotland. I appoint auditors to Transport Scotland who carry out the audit every year, and as appropriate I produce reports that pull some of that together for this committee, like the one last summer on the 5 major transport infrastructure projects did. The same is true of other major bits of investment. They're audited through the audit of the body that's doing the spending, Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board for the Southern General Hospital. I take assurance from that, but from time to time I will report to this committee so that you've got that overview. And, as I said in my answer to your last question, I think there's room for the government to continue to develop the way in which it increases transparency about that investment programme. We've seen some good progress on that. There's probably more that can be done, and we'll keep an eye on that in future too. Okay, just 2 final issues. First of all, would an audit of job creation or employment programmes be part of you? Would that be possible under your remit? In other words, looking at the work of Scottish Enterprise, Careers Scotland and other organisations, and the effectiveness of employment programmes, public employment programmes in Scotland? It would certainly be possible. I've got quite wide-ranging powers under Section 23 of the Public Finance and Accountability Act to examine the economy, efficiency and effectiveness with which government uses its resources. Mm-hmm. We work very hard to make sure both that we're focusing on areas that matter to people in Scotland and to the Parliament, but also that we're defining it in a way that our skills as auditors can actually add value. We've got a piece of work coming to the committee quite soon on modern apprenticeships, which is starting to build that strand of work for us. And Fraser's team are doing some work for me at the moment, just stepping back and looking at the whole economic development brief to look at the way money is being spent and how we can best target our audit effort to help with that in future, while not going beyond the bounds of what audit can properly do. So you can expect to hear more about it, but we're still developing our thinking in that area. Right, so it probably wouldn't be this year, but maybe in the following year we'll get something on economic development generally. Quite possibly, and we'll continue that conversation with you as our own thinking develops. As I say, it would be good to come back later this year about the 2015 programme and years after that. Okay, and finally, Convener, apologies, welfare reform, which is, welfare is clearly a reserved issue, but under welfare reform there's a number of spending commitments now for which the Scottish Government has responsibility, including mitigating the bedroom tax, new various reforms of disability benefit and so on. Have you ever looked at those areas, or would you consider looking at those areas? Yes, I'll ask Fraser to come in a minute about the work that he and the Commission are doing on looking at specifically what councils are doing to respond to welfare reform. At the level of the Scottish Government, the team that carries out that audit for me is very focused both on the risks that welfare reform throws up for public spending and at the measures that the Government is putting in place to mitigate those risks, to make sure we understand them first of all and that we're in a position to report on them if that becomes appropriate or necessary. But a lot of the work, as you'll understand, is going on through councils, and Fraser's better placed to update you on that.
And those same principles apply to the work that we look at in councils as well. So the work isn't really getting into the nature of the reforms themselves, but the impact of the reforms, how councils are preparing themselves. We did a survey on behalf of the Accounts Commission last year of councils, which gave us a sense of how councils were preparing to deal with the various changes in welfare reform, the impact on finances, impact on rent arrears, those kinds of things. And other people are doing things too. The Scottish Housing Regulator did a report last year on specifically on the impact of reform on the housing sector. So it's one of the things clearly that's on our radar in terms of keeping the programme live. The question for us is how best to get into it. I think trying to do a performance audit on welfare reform feels a bit, I'm not sure how you would do that. So the question is whether we target it on a particular sector or particular communities, or there might be different ways of actually doing the audit work. But it's absolutely up there, and as a key risk that we're keeping an eye on. Thank you.
Hey, Tavish Scott.
Thank you.
progress report, convener, one of the potential audit questions you've asked is, do elected members demonstrate ownership of financial plans? On the New Anderson High School in Lerwick, which is going to be built by the North Hub Co, the answer to that has to be no. And what I'd like, or what I'd suggest that both the Auditor General and the Accounts Commission might want to look at is, why is that answer no? No EU procurement rules apply to the building of that school. The local members don't know how much it's going to cost. They are not given any financial update on it. And there is some notional figure given to them about the percentage of work that will go to local firms based on the goodwill of the main Hubco operator. It seems to me that we've moved backwards from conventional procurement systems, where at least in that sense, when you built a new school, you tendered it and you knew how much it was going to cost, and et cetera, and you could lay rules on all that kind of thing, to a position where central government sets up this Hubco, and then after that is a take it or leave it at a local level. And there are profound issues of financial ownership, as you rightly asked the question in that, and I'd be very grateful for an assurance that that's the kind of issue that that particular local progress report would get into in the context of Ken McIntosh's earlier points.
I think the important answer to your question is that that sense of oversight and scrutiny of the way big investment decisions are being made is right at the heart of what we're trying to do across the programme and into the future. We made a start on that in the Developing Financial Reporting and Transport Infrastructure reports last summer, and we will be continuing to look at the way those big investment decisions are made and how you get the balance right between local ownership and local sustainability against economies of scale and centres of expertise, which is part of the trade-off that's in there. I talked in my opening remarks about the audit dimensions that we try to focus our work through. And financial sustainability is one of those. So is governance and financial management and transparency of financial and performance reporting, as well as value for money. And all of those, I think, come together in those sorts of decisions. My guess is, and I'll let Fraser pick this up in a minute, that you won't see much of that in this piece of work, but you will as we increase our focus on investment decisions, how they're made, and the transparency around them that gives us all assurance about future financial sustainability. Do you want to add to that, Fraser?
Not really. No, I think that covers it.
Can I just express that my concerns about any new form of, as it were, procurement and how it's done, affecting in this case local government, but ultimately affecting the taxpayer, is that there were many criticisms rightly made of pure PFI right back. That, I mean, basically, it was a trial, it was a new system invented many, many years ago now, and we all know where that went wrong. What I'd be worried about is if this is allowed to go on effectively willy-nilly over a period of years, and suddenly we find out, wait a minute, we're, as it were, mortgaging future generations of, in this case, local taxpayers, on the basis they simply don't now know what the position is. And I think that would be a profound inbuilt danger if there isn't a real hard audit of this process at this time.
Sorry, I was going to say, and certainly we've reported in the past and would continue to be concerned about, particularly in councils, I guess, but not exclusively in councils, about the ability of those who have an important governance role to understand the complexity of public finances now. There's lots of different ways in which money is being found and created and spent in terms of borrowing or creating a new alley or all sorts of stuff. And that's not to say they are bad things,
no, quite.
But there is a question about people really fully understanding the risk, the liability they're taking on, and actually how then they monitor it. So there's a kind of wider pattern there, I think, that we would be interested in. And as Caroline said, there will be a specific thing for us over the next period to get a bit more clarity of understanding and transparency around things like the Hubco programme.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask one other very brief one, convener, and that's on broadband infrastructure, which you've mentioned later on in the report. Can I very much support that work? And just my only observation on that, because you've, I think, in my view, the report scopes out what does need to be looked at. It's a good investment, and it's right that government does these things, but it's getting to the people that don't get normally helped by these kind of programmes. And it hasn't happened, if I may say so, since 1999. The current programme isn't going to make it work either. So could I just simply argue that that it's the most hardest to reach people, and it don't need to be in places like my constituency. It can be all over Scotland. That might be a specific area that would be very helpful if that work could address.
Thank you.
Thanks, convener. Actually, my comments were on broadband infrastructure as well, and I would echo what Tavish has said there. and my constituency is Edinburgh Western, and it's all extremely high-speed broadband until you get past the airport, and everything plummets after that into the what seems like the dark ages sometimes. It's something that obviously the Scottish Government has its broadband initiative ongoing, and councils were also encouraged to look for funding from the UK Government as well, which in the case of Edinburgh and I can't remember, it was Aberdeen, had been encouraged to apply for monies. It was passed. They did a whole host of work over 9, 10, 11 months to find out there was procurement difficulties, and the whole thing was scrapped, and a lesser form of initiative was then, they were encouraged to go for that, which seems to me an awful waste of money and a brutally bad piece of management there. As one considering that the local authorities are involved in this, plus the UK and Scottish governments, it would be really handy to know if there is if the problems that were set up that now looks like my constituents are going to be waiting a lot longer for high-speed broadband just 10 miles down the road here, to see that these problems have been overcome and what's actually been done. And if that can be brought into that audit, that would be really helpful.
Very helpful information for us. Angela, do you want to pick any of that up?
We haven't actually, apart from what you see in the appendix to the paper, we've done a wee bit of work. We haven't actually started scoping this piece of work yet. So the comments that you raise are certainly things that we can build into the scoping of the audit.
It's virtually a weekly mailbag for me. Where is our digital broadband?
Yeah.
If you headed to Kirkliston or parts of Queensferry, that rural part of Western Edinburgh.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. If there are no further questions, can I thank the Auditor General and her team for their contribution. We'll move to item 5 and we'll move into private session.